Hey everyone, tonight we're traveling to a place built on nothing but heat, dust, and stubborn human hope. A stretch of desert so hostile that for centuries it seemed to actively reject the idea of people living there at all, and yet it eventually became the most famous gambling city on the entire planet. Las Vegas. Before we get comfortable, if this is your first time here, welcome. If you keep coming back night after night, thank you, genuinely. This channel exists because of you, and if there's ever a piece of history you want turned into something to fall asleep to, drop it in the comments. I read all of them. Now go ahead and dim the lights, get your blanket arranged just right, maybe turn on a fan for that steady hum and let your body settle in because we're about to take a long, slow walk through the past. There's no reason to fight sleep tonight. If you drift off in the next 10 minutes, that's perfectly fine. This story will still be here. Let's start with a question. What would it take for you to build a city in a place with almost no water, brutal heat, and nothing valuable in the ground? Would you have the patience to bet everything on a patch of desert other people had already given up on? Would you have survived a summer in a valley where the ground itself seemed to be trying to kill you? And if you'd been standing in that heat in the early 1900s, bidding on a plot of dirt with no buildings, no shade, and no guarantee of anything, would you have opened your wallet, or would you have gotten back on the train? Now imagine waking up in that exact spot, decades later. Congratulations. It's 1931. You're broke, the country is broke, and somebody just told you that this dusty stretch of nowhere is about to become the one place in America where the rules don't apply. Let's see how that happened. Long before any of this, long before a single light bulb burned in the desert night, there was only the Mojave, and the Mojave was not interested in company. This was a valley of cracked, sun-baked earth, thin, brittle brush, and heat that could climb past 110 degrees in summer while dropping to a bitter chill after dark. Water was so rare here that most people traveling through gave the whole region a wide berth if they possibly could. But underneath that harsh, unwelcoming surface, something unusual was happening. Natural springs fed by underground water pushed up through the sand in a handful of spots, creating small patches of green in an otherwise lifeless landscape. It wasn't much. A few acres of wild grass fed by hidden water. But in a desert like this, even a small patch of green counts as something close to a miracle, and miracles tend to draw visitors. Picture standing in this valley yourself. The horizon offers nothing but shimmering heat and pale rock. The air presses against your skin like a warm, dry blanket, and within an hour your lips are already cracking. There's no real shade to speak of, unless you count the thin shadow cast by a Joshua tree, and a Joshua tree is really just a spiky, awkward-looking plant that seems more like it's mocking you than offering comfort. The ground splits into a web of cracks, wide enough in places to twist an ankle, and in the afternoon heat, the whole landscape seems to ripple and blur, as if reality itself were starting to melt. Every living thing out here has spent generations learning to avoid the daylight entirely. Scorpions hide beneath stones. Lizards flatten themselves into whatever shade exists. Rattlesnakes wait patiently for the sun to drop before they move at all. This is a landscape built almost entirely around the principle of staying out of sight until nightfall, and that alone tells you how unwelcoming it truly was. And yet, somewhere beneath all that hostile, cracked earth, ancient water made its way upward, cool and impossibly clean, coaxing thin green shoots out of ground that seemed to have no business growing anything at all. To a traveler who had just crossed 100 miles of dust and glare, stumbling across a patch of grass like this must have felt like a hallucination. Exactly the kind of vision you see right before collapsing face first into the sand. Except this one was real. You could kneel down, cup the water in your cracked and blistered hands, and actually drink it. That is the strange, quiet seed at the center of this entire story. Not gold, not silver, not some grand strategic prize fought over by empires. Just a small, unassuming wetland hidden in the middle of nowhere, kept alive by water no one could even see. Every fountain that would one day rise from this ground, every swimming pool surrounded by sunbathing tourists, every glass of iced water served beside a card table, All of it traces back to that quiet green smudge in an otherwise empty map. The desert, of course, had no idea what it was about to unleash. For countless centuries, it had successfully kept people away using the simple, effective strategy of being almost completely unlivable. It had won every single round for longer than anyone could measure. But water changes everything, and a thirsty traveler will forgive almost any hardship if there's a drink waiting at the end of it. The Mojave had, without meaning to, left a door open, and walking through that door would turn out to be one of the more consequential decisions in American history. The little meadow had no idea it was about to become world famous. For generations before any of this, the southern Paiute people lived closely with this land, moving with the seasons, gathering mesquite beans, and treating these fragile springs with the respect a genuine lifeline deserves. Then, in the early 1800s, outsiders began arriving, following a difficult and dangerous trade route connecting New Mexico to California, a path that would eventually become known as the Old Spanish Trail. In 1829, a young scout by the name of Rafael Rivera reportedly wandered off that main path and stumbled directly onto the green oasis hidden in the sand. The Spanish-speaking travelers who came after him gave the spot a simple, grateful name, Las Vegas, meaning the meadows. There's a certain quiet irony worth sitting with here. This city, which would one day drown itself nightly in artificial light and endless noise, was originally named after a peaceful field of grass. Las Vegas, the meadows. Not Las Vegas, the endless casino floor. Not Las Vegas, the all-night buffet of bad decisions. Just the meadows, a name you'd expect to find on a quiet retirement community, all soft breezes and gentle green lawns. Instead, it ended up attached to one of the loudest, most frantic cities America would ever produce. Naming this place, the meadows, is a bit like naming a hurricane gentle breeze, and the mismatch never quite went away. For the exhausted travelers crossing that brutal trail, though, the name made perfect sense. Imagine spending weeks on a punishing desert crossing, your pack animals stumbling, your water supply gone stale and then simply gone entirely. The trail behind you looks like a graveyard of good intentions, and then, almost impossible to believe, you crest a rise and there it is. Green. Actual green, with the sound of water reaching your ears before your eyes even confirm it's real. You would probably name a place like that something hopeful too. It's worth remembering that the Paiute people had already been living sustainably around these springs for generations, which matters whenever this story gets told as though Rivera stumbled onto empty, undiscovered land. It wasn't empty. It was known, mapped in memory, deeply woven into a way of life that understood this desert far better than any newcomer ever would. The outsiders didn't discover the meadows so much as they blundered into a place that other people had been carefully tending all along, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again as this story continues. But names carry weight, and once a place has a name attached to a route, it becomes a landmark. A landmark becomes a stopping point. A stopping point becomes somewhere people expect to find, a fixed spot in an otherwise shifting landscape. Every traveler who paused here to water their animals and refill their canteens was, without realizing it, casting a small vote for this patch of desert to matter. None of them had the faintest idea what they were setting into motion. They were simply trying to survive the journey to California with their lives and livestock intact. If you had told any of these travelers that their humble rest stop would someday host fountains choreographed to music, and a scaled-down replica of the Eiffel Tower, they would have assumed you'd been out in the sun too long. And honestly, that would have been a fair assumption. The first serious attempt to settle the meadows didn't come from prospectors or outlaws, but from devout Mormon missionaries sent south from Salt Lake City in 1855. They built an adobe fort near the springs, tried to establish crops, and set about the difficult work of farming a place that had absolutely no interest in being farmed. It went about as well as you'd expect. The heat was merciless, the soil stubborn and unforgiving. A nearby lead deposit turned out to be too impure to be worth mining, and relations with the local Paiute grew increasingly strained. Within just a few years, the mission was abandoned, the fort left to crumble in the heat. The desert had won this round decisively, and it would be decades before anyone tried again. Think about the kind of optimism it took to even volunteer for an assignment like that. You're a missionary, and someone hands you instructions that essentially amount to travel into the hottest, driest, least cooperative valley we can find, and build civilization there. It's roughly the same energy as being asked to open an ice cream stand on the surface of the sun. And yet they packed their tools, their seeds, their faith, and marched into the valley anyway, armed mostly with hope and a serious misunderstanding of exactly what they were walking into. The fort itself really was an achievement. Thick adobe walls, raised by hand under a punishing sun, sweat evaporating before it even had the chance to drip. Building anything out here meant mixing mud and straw under conditions that seemed almost personally hostile, then stacking bricks while your shirt fused to your back. It's the kind of physical labor that makes a modern gym session look almost insulting by comparison. These men worked themselves to exhaustion, and the walls they built were genuinely solid. The farming, unfortunately, was where all that hope went to die. This soil doesn't want your seeds. It wants your seeds to struggle. Water the crops, and the heat evaporates the moisture before the roots can even absorb it. Manage to coax a few green shoots upward, and the relentless sun scorches them flat within days. Every harvest became a negotiation with a landscape that had absolutely no interest in negotiating, a bit like trying to grow tomatoes on a hot griddle while someone keeps turning up the heat. The wild grass fed by the springs did just fine on its own, but scheduled, deliberate farming proved to be an entirely different and far crueler challenge. Then there was the failed mining venture, built on the hope that nearby hills held valuable lead. The missionaries dug, hauled, and smelted, only to find the ore stubbornly impure, tangled with other minerals, and not worth the backbreaking effort required to extract it. What they didn't realize at the time was that this same ore contained silver, a fortune sitting right beneath their feet that their disappointment had blinded them to completely. It's almost too fitting. The missionaries walked away in frustration, having literally stood on top of riches they mistook for garbage. Even this early in its history, Las Vegas seemed to specialize in hiding value behind a discouraging front. Relations with the Paiute deteriorated under the mounting pressure, supplies dwindled, morale sank even lower than the water table, and eventually the entire mission was quietly called off. The settlers packed up their faith and their blistered hands and retreated north, leaving the fort to slowly crumble back into the dirt it came from. The desert exhaled and reclaimed its meadow. And here's the quiet lesson buried in all that failure. Las Vegas would never be conquered by people trying to tame it, farm it, or force it into respectability. It only ever thrived once people stopped trying to make it behave and instead leaned fully into whatever it actually was. The missionaries wanted the meadows to be wholesome and productive. The meadows, it turned out, had entirely different plans. Las Vegas didn't truly become a town until something arrived that the desert simply couldn't outlast: the railroad. At the start of the 20th century, a rail line was being constructed to connect Salt Lake City with Los Angeles, and the planners needed a stopping point roughly halfway along the route to service the engines and supply water to the crews. Those old artesian springs made the meadows the obvious choice. On a scorching day in May of 1905, the railroad company auctioned off parcels of dusty land to eager buyers standing under the open sun, and just like that, a town was sold into existence lot by lot. There was no grand vision behind this, no dream of glittering resorts, just steel rails, water tanks, and a name printed on a map. It's worth appreciating just how unglamorous this founding really was. Great cities love to imagine themselves born from noble ideals or visionaries staring thoughtfully at the horizon. Las Vegas exists because a train needed a drink. That's really the whole story. Steam engines, like every other thirsty traveler who ever passed through, needed water in the desert, and the meadows happened to have some. If locomotives had run on anything other than boiled water, there's a genuine chance this city might never have existed at all. Picture that auction for a moment. It's May, which in this valley means the punishing summer heat has already begun its long campaign against human comfort. Buyers stand out in the open sun, sweating through their good clothes, bidding on identical rectangles of bare dirt that all look exactly the same. There are no streets yet, no buildings worth mentioning. Just surveyor's stakes hammered into the ground and a considerable amount of imagination. Buying land here required a very particular kind of faith, the ability to look at scorched, empty nothing and somehow picture a future in it, or more realistically, the ability to study a train schedule and do some hopeful arithmetic. The railroad brought real structure, and structure is exactly what turns a rest stop into an actual town. Suddenly there were rail yards, a depot, repair shops for the engines, and steady jobs for the men who kept the whole operation running. Where travelers had once paused briefly and moved on, people now stayed. They needed housing, food, supplies, and being human, a handful of less wholesome comforts after a long shift. A permanent population began gathering around the tracks the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape. What made the railroad so pivotal is that it accomplished something the springs alone never could. It connected this place to the wider world. Before the rails arrived, the meadows had been a lonely dot along a punishing trail, isolated and easily abandoned, exactly as the failed mission had already proven. After the rails, Las Vegas became a node on a much larger network, plugged directly into the commerce and movement of an entire growing nation. Goods flowed in, people flowed through. And the town gained a heartbeat that no longer depended purely on the whims of weather and water. Still, let's not oversell the glamour here. Early railroad-era Las Vegas was a hot, dusty, hard-drinking little settlement whose main appeal was simply that a train happened to stop there. The grand resorts were still decades away, unimaginable to the sunburned buyers sweating through that opening auction. What existed at this point was raw, functional, and unpolished, a working service town for a machine, wearing its purpose plainly for anyone to see. But the essential trick had already been performed. A place the desert had successfully discouraged for centuries now had a real reason to persist, a reason built out of steel, steam, and simple thirst. The train had drawn a line in the sand, and this time the line held. The meadows had finally, permanently become somewhere. What kind of somewhere it would eventually become? Well, nobody standing at that dusty auction could have possibly guessed, and most of them likely wouldn't have believed it if you told them. A railroad town in the early 1900s was, by nature, a rough and restless place, and Las Vegas was no exception to that rule. The men laying track and working the yards wanted exactly three things after a long, brutal shift: a drink, a game of chance, and some company. And the town obligingly provided all three in a compact little district that became known as Block 16. Here, saloons ran at all hours, backroom card games rattled through the night, and the line between what was legal and what wasn't functioned more like a gentle suggestion than an actual wall. This was the true seed of everything that followed. Long before anyone dreamed of a glittering strip lined with resorts, Las Vegas had already quietly discovered its real talent, offering people exactly the vices that more respectable towns pretended they didn't want. Let's properly set the scene, because Block 16 deserves it. Picture a short stretch of street where the buildings lean close together and the noise never fully stops. During the day it simmers quietly in the heat, a little run-down and unremarkable, but at night it comes alive. Lamplight spills out through saloon doorways. Glasses clink somewhere in the dark. There's the low murmur of a card game in progress, and the particular kind of laughter that only comes from people determined to forget they'll be back at work again before sunrise. It's loud. It's a little dangerous. And it's exactly where everyone wants to be. The real cleverness in this arrangement, if you can call it that, was concentration. The town's more respectable planners didn't try to eliminate vice entirely, because they weren't foolish enough to believe that thirsty railroad workers wouldn't find their whiskey one way or another. Instead, they penned all of it into a single district, a designated zone where the drinking, gambling, and other entertainments could happen safely out of the way. It was essentially the civic version of telling your rowdiest houseguests to please keep the noise confined to the garage. Everyone knew exactly what happened in Block 16, and everyone had quietly agreed not to make a fuss about it. For the working men of the town, this was heaven, splinters and all. After 10 or 12 hours of grueling labor in the rail yards, hauling and hammering under a sun that never seemed to let up, a man wanted some relief, and Block 16 sold relief in every available form. A cold drink to wash the dust out of your throat. A hand of cards for one thrilling moment where luck might actually smile on you. It was the release valve for a town built entirely on hard, grinding labor, and it hissed steam every single night without fail. The gambling in particular deserves a closer look, because this is the true origin point of everything that came later. Those rough backroom dice games and card tables were the humble ancestors of every gleaming casino that would eventually rise along the strip. There were no chandeliers here, no dancing fountains, no complimentary drinks delivered by roaming staff, just a battered table, a deck of cards, and men wagering their hard-earned wages against the odds and against each other. The stakes were smaller and the setting was far grimmer, but the essential transaction, hope traded for the near certainty of loss, was already fully formed and functioning exactly as it always would. What's genuinely striking is how early this town discovered its real calling. Other frontier settlements dreamed of becoming centers of farming, industry, or refined culture. Las Vegas had already tried farming, remember, and the desert had laughed the whole attempt right out of the valley. But vice took root here immediately, and it grew like the one crop this soil could actually sustain. The town discovered that its true talent wasn't making things or growing things, but providing exactly the pleasures that stricter, more respectable places preferred to keep hidden in the shadows. Block 16 eventually faded as the town grew and shifted around it, but its spirit never really left. It simply changed its clothes, trading rough wooden boards for neon and dust for carpet. The original character of this place, if we want to call it that, was baked in from the very beginning. Las Vegas was always destined to be the place where America came to misbehave. It just hadn't built the palaces for it yet. Here's a twist that surprises almost everyone who hears this story for the first time. For a solid stretch of its early life, gambling in Nevada was actually completely illegal. In 1910, a wave of reform-minded morality swept across the state, and lawmakers banned the games outright, hopping to scrub the frontier clean of vice entirely. Naturally, this accomplished almost nothing of substance. The card tables didn't vanish. They simply retreated behind locked doors, into back rooms and quiet speakeasies, protected by a convenient wink from the local sheriff, and a shared understanding that the law here was more of a costume than an actual cage. For roughly 2 decades, gambling in Las Vegas lived comfortably in the shadow, thriving precisely because everyone involved had agreed to pretend it had disappeared. Prohibition would soon add liquor to this same cozy arrangement. It's one of history's better jokes that Nevada, a state whose entire modern identity is built around gambling, once tried to outlaw the very activity that would eventually make it world famous. It's a bit like a bakery banning bread or a lifeguard declaring the ocean permanently off limits. The law existed on paper, stern and official sounding, and in the actual lived reality of the town, it functioned about as effectively as a screen door on a submarine. The reformers meant well. Reality had entirely different plans. Picture how this ban actually worked in practice, which is to say, barely at all. A game that had once rattled along openly inside a saloon simply relocated to the room directly behind it. Same players, same dice, same money-changing hands, just now with a closed door between the action and the street, and a lookout who knew exactly which knock meant trouble was coming. If you wanted to gamble in Las Vegas during these years, you didn't have to search very hard. You just had to know somebody, and it turned out that everybody knew somebody. Local law enforcement played its part in this quiet theater beautifully. A sheriff could stroll casually past a back room buzzing with illegal games and suddenly develop a very convenient case of selective hearing. Raids did happen occasionally, sure, but usually with more than enough advance warning that the tables were cleared, and the players had scattered well before any one official actually arrived, leaving behind nothing but an innocent-looking empty room and a great deal of shrugging. It was enforcement functioning purely as performance art, a show staged for the benefit of reformers watching from up north, so everyone could comfortably agree that the law was technically being respected. Nobody actually believed that, of course, which was really the entire point of the exercise. This is precisely where Las Vegas learned a skill it would rely on for decades to come, the art of conducting forbidden business in plain sight, with the quiet blessing of the very people who were supposedly there to stop it. The town didn't fight the ban directly. It simply absorbed the restriction, adapted around it, and kept right on making money underneath it. When prohibition arrived nationally, it slotted perfectly into this existing arrangement. Alcohol became illegal too, so it joined the gambling in those same back rooms, and Las Vegas ran its speakeasies with the exact same practiced, winking efficiency. Two vices for the price of one convenient blind eye. There's something almost admirable in the sheer futility of trying to legislate this particular town into virtue. You could pass whatever laws you liked up in the state capitol, and down in the meadows the games carried on exactly as before. The drinks kept getting poured, and the money kept flowing, because the demand was essentially bottomless, and this desert had always been a place where official rules seemed to go a little soft around the edges. The ban didn't clean up Las Vegas in any meaningful sense. It simply taught Las Vegas to keep its real business tucked behind a friendly closed door. So when we eventually arrive at the moment gambling becomes legal again, understand clearly that nothing on the ground actually changed. The games had never really stopped running in the first place. All that happened was that the official pretense finally caught up with the everyday practice. Las Vegas had been running a wide-open gambling town this entire time. It was simply about to get permission to admit it out loud, and being Las Vegas, it would go on to admit it very loudly indeed. Then came the moment that quietly rewired the future of the entire American West. In March of 1931, deep in the misery of the Great Depression, Nevada made a calculated bet unlike anything most states would have dared to consider. Broke, desperate, and watching what little tax revenue it had simply evaporate month after month, the state legislature voted to legalize wide-open gambling, hopping to pull money out of pockets across the entire country and into its own struggling economy. On that very same legislative wave, lawmakers also loosened the state's divorce laws to a degree that scandalized the rest of the nation, making Nevada the one place in America where you could shed both your money and your spouse in record time. It was a shameless, oddly brilliant, faintly ridiculous gamble. Other states clutched their pearls in horror. Nevada simply shrugged, dealt the cards, and waited to see exactly who would show up. Spoiler: eventually, everyone would. To really understand this decision, you have to feel the genuine desperation of the moment. The Great Depression had flattened the entire country. Banks were failing left and right. Jobs were vanishing by the thousands, and states everywhere watched their revenues dry up like puddles under the Mojave sun. Nevada, never a wealthy state to begin with, was in real, serious trouble. And when you're broke enough, the moral objections that felt so important during fatter years start to look suspiciously like luxuries you simply can't afford anymore. So the state looked hard at the one thing it had always quietly been good at, the very vice it had spent the past 2 decades pretending to ban, and asked itself a simple question: why not just tax it instead? It was, frankly, a stroke of cornered animal genius. Every single backroom game already running throughout Las Vegas represented money changing hands entirely off the state's official books. Legalize it, license it properly, tax it accordingly, and suddenly all of that previously hidden activity becomes a legitimate revenue stream operating in broad daylight. Nevada didn't actually create a gambling industry in 1931. It simply stopped pretending to ignore the one that had already existed for decades and started collecting its share. It's the fiscal equivalent of discovering there's been a working oil well quietly sitting in your backyard the entire time, and you've just been carefully stepping around it out of habit. The divorce angle applied the exact same trick to a different kind of vice entirely. In an era when ending a marriage anywhere else in the country was a slow, humiliating, nearly impossible ordeal that could drag on for years, Nevada slashed its residency requirement down to almost nothing and made splitting up shockingly convenient. Suddenly, the unhappily married across America had a clear destination in mind. You could travel out to Nevada, wait out a short, mandated stay, and emerge on the other side legally single, all while local hotels and casinos happily separated you from a good portion of your money during the waiting period. It was a genuine masterpiece of turning other people's personal problems into steady local profit. Come for the divorce, stay for the roulette wheel. The rest of the country was thoroughly appalled by all of this, which really only helped matters along. While more respectable states wrung their hands over the moral implications, Nevada quietly positioned itself as the one place in America where the fun was fully permitted and the judgment was checked firmly at the border. That contrast quickly became a genuine selling point. If everywhere else in the country was going to be stuffy and restrictive, then Las Vegas would happily serve as the release valve for the entire nation, the one spot where the rules relaxed and nobody who actually mattered was watching too closely. Being the black sheep of American states, it turned out, was extraordinarily good for business. What makes this particular moment so pivotal is that it took the town's existing shadow economy and finally gave it a real foundation to build upon. As long as gambling remained illegal, it could only ever exist as whispered backroom deals, limited entirely by its own need for secrecy. But legalize it, and suddenly you can build openly. You can invest real capital. You can put up an actual building with an actual sign out front and advertise to the entire world without any fear of a sudden raid. The ceiling that had kept Las Vegas contained for decades simply lifted away overnight. Nobody sitting in that 1931 legislature could possibly have pictured the strip that would eventually rise here, the mega resorts, the fountains, the sprawling global empire still decades away. They were simply trying to keep the lights on during the worst economic disaster anyone alive could remember. But desperation, as it turns out, can be a remarkable innovator when pushed far enough. Nevada made a nervous, broke, faintly disreputable bet at what felt like rock bottom, and that single gamble quietly laid the legal groundwork for absolutely everything the Meadows would eventually become. The house, in a very real sense, had just placed its very first wager, and the house, as always, was about to win big. Legalized gambling was the spark, but sparks need fuel to actually catch, and that fuel arrived in the form of the single largest construction project this entire region had ever seen. The mighty Hoover Dam, known at the time as Boulder Dam. Beginning in 1931, thousands of workers poured into the surrounding area to help tame the powerful Colorado River. And while the federal government built these workers a tidy, orderly settlement called Boulder City, where gambling and drinking were both strictly forbidden, the workers themselves had entirely different ideas about how to spend their time off. On their days away from the site, they drove straight into Las Vegas to spend their hard-earned pay on precisely the things Boulder City refused to offer them. The dam gave Las Vegas its very first reliable flood of paying customers, and just as importantly, it delivered cheap, abundant electricity. This town was about to get very, very bright indeed. The timing here feels almost suspiciously perfect. In the exact same year, Nevada legalized gambling statewide. A massive federal project landed right on the town's doorstep, bringing with it an entire army of workers carrying real wages in their pockets and a powerful thirst for release after brutal shifts. It's almost as if the universe took one look at the Meadows, freshly permitted to run its games out in the open, and decided to hand it thousands of paying customers to get the whole enterprise properly started. Las Vegas didn't have to go searching for its first significant crowd. The crowd came here to pour concrete and then stayed behind to lose their money at the tables. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of what was actually happening just a short drive away. Building this dam meant tamming one of the most powerful rivers in the entire American West, a job so massive it bordered on the absurd. Workers labored under blistering canyon heat, clinging to sheer cliff faces, pouring almost unimaginable quantities of concrete, performing dangerous, exhausting, occasionally fatal work day after grueling day. It stands as one of the truly great engineering achievements of the age, and the men who accomplished it were left tired, sweaty, and very much in need of somewhere to properly blow off steam once their shift finally ended. Here's where the federal government made a rather delightful miscalculation. Anticipating that a massive project full of rough, hardworking laborers might naturally attract vice of one kind or another, the authorities built Boulder City as a clean, orderly, thoroughly wholesome company town, a place governed by rules where gambling and liquor were both strictly outlawed. The intention behind this was genuinely noble. The actual result was that they'd inadvertently built a dam of temptation directly beside Las Vegas, which sat conveniently ready to serve as the spillway. Ban a hardworking man from having any fun where he lives, and he will simply drive somewhere the fun happens to be legal. That's just human nature, and human nature in this case had a car and a free afternoon. So every single payday, a steady stream of dam workers rolled straight into Las Vegas to enjoy exactly what Boulder City refused to offer them. They drank the drinks, played the games, and spent their wages freely in the saloons and gambling halls, injecting a steady, reliable current of cash directly into the young, newly legal industry. Boulder City's strict virtue effectively functioned as a marketing campaign for Las Vegas's sin. The tighter one town squeezed its restrictions, the more business simply squirted over to the other. You couldn't have designed a more perfect arrangement if you'd actually tried, though nobody involved had actually planned it that way. It simply happened on its own, but the workers were only half of this particular gift. The dam's true, lasting legacy for Las Vegas turned out to be power in the most literal sense. Hoover Dam was built to generate electricity on an absolutely massive scale, and suddenly this remote, forgotten desert town had access to cheap, abundant energy, precisely the resource a future city of dazzling lights would one day consume by the ton. Every neon sign that would eventually rise here, every glowing marquee, every illuminated fountain and blazing casino floor would ultimately run on power traced directly back to the water thundering through that dam. The desert had always had endless sunlight. Now it had electricity too, and it was about to combine the two into something visible from space. The dam also brought real roads, genuine infrastructure, and a lasting sense that this particular corner of the desert was finally worth serious investment. A town that had scraped by on railroad thirst and backroom card games now had a legitimate economic engine humming right next door. The workers would eventually finish the project and move on to other jobs, but the power stayed. The reputation stayed. And the habit of coming to Las Vegas for a genuinely good time was now firmly established across the entire region. The Meadows had been handed both a reliable customer base and a permanent power supply in a single stroke of extraordinary luck. All that remained now was to plug in the lights and see what happened. As the dam's money flowed steadily into town, and visitors kept arriving in growing numbers, downtown Las Vegas began its first real transformation. The heart of all this activity was Fremont Street, where small clubs and casinos crowded tightly together, each one competing to outshine its immediate neighbor with brighter, flashier electric signs. This was the true birthplace of the glow, the strip of pavement that would later earn the nickname Glitter Gulch, thanks to the sheer amount of wattage crammed into just a few short blocks. Gamblers wandered casually from one smoky room to the next, chasing their luck under buzzing bulbs, while the desert night pressed dark and silent just beyond the very last street lamp. It was modest by later standards, Sure, but for a dusty little railroad town, Fremont Street genuinely felt like a carnival that simply refused to close its doors. To properly picture Fremont Street during these years, imagine a narrow river of light cutting cleanly through the pitch-black desert night. On either side, casinos pressed shoulder to shoulder, each doorway spilling noise and glow directly onto the pavement, each rooftop and storefront fighting hard for your attention with its own electric signage. Step out of one club and the next one is already right there, close enough to touch, already beckoning you inside. It was compact, chaotic, and gloriously overstimulating, a genuine sensory ambush after the vast, silent darkness of the surrounding valley. The fierce competition among these establishments is really what lit the fuse here, quite literally. When your casino sits directly beside a rival casino, and you're both fishing for the exact same wandering gamblers, you need some kind of edge, and the edge everyone reached for instinctively was light. Put up a bright new sign, and your neighbor immediately puts up a brighter one. Add a few flashing bulbs, and suddenly the place next door is a full blaze of color. It quickly became an arms race measured entirely in wattage, with each owner thoroughly convinced that the flashiest facade would catch the most eyes, and more importantly, the most wallets. Nobody could afford to be the one dark, unremarkable storefront on a street otherwise full of stars. And it worked, because light does something genuinely powerful to the human animal, especially out here in the desert. Beyond these blocks, night means near total blackness, a vast, empty darkness where the only honest thing left to do is sleep. Fremont Street rebelled completely against that natural order. It declared boldly that night was actually for spending, for playing, for staying awake and staying thoroughly entertained, and it used electricity to make that declaration absolutely impossible to ignore. You've probably noticed how a moth simply cannot resist a porch light. Fremont Street ran on that exact same basic principle, except in this case, the moths happened to be carrying paychecks. The nickname Glitter Gulch captured this mixture perfectly, that strange blend of frontier grit and dazzling excess. This was still, at its core, a rough desert town, dusty and largely unpolished, and yet crammed into these few short blocks was more raw light and glamour than most cities anywhere could ever hope to muster. The contrast really was the entire charm of the place. You could drive across 100 miles of silent, empty nothingness, and then suddenly arrive at this improbable little canyon of neon, roaring away in the middle of an otherwise total wasteland. It made no logical sense whatsoever, which is exactly why it delighted so many people. Inside those glowing rooms, the actual business of the place proceeded exactly as it always had. The smoke hung thick in the air, the cards flipped steadily, the dice tumbled across green felt, the wheels spun round and round, and the money migrated steadily from visitors' pockets into the house's coffers. The lights out front were simply the lure, bright and cheerful and endlessly welcoming, and the tables inside were the actual point of it all. Patient, mathematical, and thoroughly undefeated, Fremont Street had perfected a formula that Las Vegas would rely on forever afterward. Dazzle them thoroughly at the door, then quietly and efficiently take their money once they're safely through it. For all its considerable energy, though, Fremont Street was still thinking relatively small. These were modest clubs and casinos, downtown establishments built to serve the crowds arriving by rail or rolling in from the nearby dam project. The truly enormous dreams, the sprawling resorts, the swimming pools, the towering palaces, hadn't yet occurred to anyone at all. All the action at this point in the story was concentrated right here, in the tight, bright heart of downtown, and it genuinely seemed like the natural center of gravity for the entire town going forward. Everyone simply assumed Las Vegas would always revolve around this one glittering gulch. They were wrong, of course, though nobody could have known it yet. While Fremont Street blazed away downtown, a lonely stretch of highway out on the edge of town sat quiet and dark, patiently waiting for someone to finally notice what it could become. The glow of Las Vegas had been born on Fremont Street, but it was about to pack up its bags and move somewhere with a great deal more room to spread out. Las Vegas had one more piece of extraordinary geographic luck built directly into its location. A straight shot of highway leading right to a city bursting with cash and restless dreamers. Los Angeles. Highway 91 carried a steady, constant stream of Californians eastward across the desert, and it took a clever entrepreneur to realize that these travelers were reaching the edge of town long before they ever got anywhere near downtown. If you could catch them first, right there on the open road, you could pull them in before Fremont Street ever got the chance to compete for their attention. That dusty stretch of highway just outside the city limits was about to become the single most valuable piece of real estate in the entire desert, though at the time, almost nobody had noticed it. Geography, it turns out, had been quietly dealing Las Vegas a winning hand this entire time. First the springs, then the railroad, then the dam, and now this, a direct road connecting the town to one of the fastest-growing, most cash-soaked cities in the entire country. Los Angeles was booming, full of people with genuine money and a powerful appetite for entertainment, and the highway laid a convenient ribbon of asphalt straight from their world into the meadows. If Las Vegas had deliberately tried to design the perfect supply line of eager, willing customers, it could hardly have done any better than a paved road running straight to Hollywood's doorstep. Think for a moment about who was actually making that drive. Not weary railroad workers or exhausted dam laborers this time, but Californians, many of them carrying real money and a genuine taste for glamour, looking for a weekend's worth of fun that their own state made harder to find. They pointed their cars east, crossed the shimmering desert, and arrived in Las Vegas primed and ready to spend. It was a fundamentally different and considerably richer kind of visitor, and they arrived by the carload. Here's the crucial detail, the one that would eventually remake the entire city. These drivers coming in from Los Angeles reached the outskirts of Las Vegas well before they ever got downtown to Fremont Street. They passed straight through that empty edge-of-town stretch first, tired after hours of desert driving, more than ready to stop, and there was absolutely nothing out there to catch them. All the action, all the glitter, sat clustered downtown, several minutes further along the road, which meant that whoever built something right there on the incoming highway would intercept every single one of those travelers before the downtown casinos even knew they'd arrived. It's such a simple insight in hindsight, and yet it took a very particular kind of mind to actually see it clearly. Everyone else looked at that barren roadside and saw exactly what it appeared to be: worthless scrub sitting outside the city limits, too far removed from the real action to matter much at all. The land was cheap because it seemed genuinely pointless, but flip your perspective around. Look at it instead from the driver's seat of a car rolling in from California, and that exact same worthless dirt suddenly reveals itself as the true front door to the entire town. You would reach it first. You would be exhausted. You would be more than ready to stop, and you would pull over at whatever inviting thing happened to be waiting there for you. There was another quiet advantage tied to that particular location, too. Sitting just outside the city limits meant sitting just outside the city's rules and taxes as well, a bit of welcome breathing room from municipal oversight. For anyone hopping to build something genuinely big and freewheeling, land situated beyond the official edge of town carried a certain undeniable appeal. It was close enough to catch the incoming crowds, and just far enough away to enjoy a considerably looser leash. For now, though, the land remained empty, a lonely span of highway with nothing but desert stretching away in every direction. Cars from Los Angeles rushed straight past it toward the downtown lights, and the potential simply sat there completely unrealized, invisible to almost everyone who passed. It was, in effect, the most valuable stretch of nothing in the entire country, and it was waiting for just one person to look at all that emptiness and picture, of all things, a shimmering swimming pool sitting right beside the road. That person was about to arrive, and once he did, the center of gravity for the entire city would begin its slow, permanent slide away from downtown and out onto the open highway. In 1941, a hotel operator named Thomas Hull did something that struck most people at the time as faintly insane. Rather than building in the busy, established downtown, he chose to put his new resort out on that lonely stretch of Highway 91, surrounded by nothing but sand and scattered creosote bushes. His creation, the El Rancho Vegas, wasn't simply a casino. It was an entire experience. A low-slung, ranch-style resort featuring a swimming pool clearly visible from the road, air conditioning throughout, a proper restaurant, and rooms where visitors could actually spend the night. The pool turned out to be the true masterstroke, a shimmering blue promise waving down every exhausted, sweating driver who happened to pass by. Hull had, almost by accident, invented the entire blueprint for what would become the Strip, and that desert roadside would never sit empty again. Put yourself briefly in the minds of the locals watching all of this unfold. Here's a respected, experienced hotel man, someone who presumably understands the business well, and he's chosen to build his resort out in the middle of nowhere, well past the edge of town, where his only real neighbors are lizards and the occasional confused tumbleweed. Downtown already had the crowds, the lights, the established action people expected. Hull looked at all of that and essentially said, "No thank you, I'll take the empty dirt out by the road instead." It seemed to most observers like the decision of a man who'd spent a little too much time under the desert sun, but Hull was seeing something the skeptics around him simply weren't. He understood those Lowe's Angels drivers, understood exactly how they arrived, hot, exhausted, and more than ready to stop well before they ever reached downtown. And he understood something even more important than that. People didn't just want a smoky room to gamble in. They wanted genuine comfort, a sense of escape, an entire experience wrapped comfortably around the gambling itself. So he didn't simply build a casino. He built a full resort, and the difference turned out to be everything. The pool deserves its own moment of proper appreciation here, because it really was the stroke of genius that made the whole thing work. Imagine you're one of those drivers crossing miles and miles of blistering desert highway. The heat pours relentlessly through your windshield. Your shirt is completely soaked through. Your patience has long since run out. And there, rising unexpectedly out of the scrub right beside the road, is a shimmer of impossibly blue water, cool, clear, and utterly beckoning. It's a mirage that turns out to actually be real. After a drive like that, resisting it would take a kind of willpower most people simply don't have, and Hull was betting correctly that the vast majority of travelers had no such reserves left. Then there was the air conditioning, which in this particular valley is far less a luxury than it is an act of genuine mercy. Offering a cool, comfortable refuge from the murderous outdoor heat meant offering something people would gladly pay handsomely for and remember fondly for years afterward. Combine that with a proper restaurant and real rooms to actually sleep in, and Hull had created a place you didn't simply visit for an hour and leave. You could arrive, cool off, swim, eat a proper meal, gamble a little, and then stay the entire night, all within one self-contained desert oasis. He had successfully bundled the whole idea of a desert getaway into a single convenient stop. This is really the true birth of the Las Vegas resort model, the exact idea that would eventually balloon into the sprawling mega-resorts of later decades. Hull grasped the core principle first, that gambling goes down considerably easier when it's comfortably surrounded by pleasure. Give people a nice pool, a cool room, a decent meal, and a comfortable bed, and they relax. And relaxed, happy people who feel genuinely pampered and at ease turn out to be far more generous with their money once they sit down at the tables. The resort exists, in a very real sense, to soften you up first. The house collects its winnings either way. The ranch-style design suited the whole moment perfectly too, all low buildings and rustic western charm, offering visitors a fantasy of the frontier without any of the actual hardship involved. It felt like a genuine destination, a place with real character, rather than simply a building where you happen to lose your money. Hull had wrapped his entire enterprise in a compelling theme, another idea Las Vegas would continue running with for the rest of its existence. The El Rancho Vegas proved conclusively that the impossible wasn't just possible, it was genuinely profitable. That worthless roadside, that empty stretch of dirt everyone had previously dismissed, was now hosting a thriving resort, pulling in the incoming crowds exactly as Hull had confidently predicted. The lonely stretch of Highway 91 finally had its first real jewel, and it certainly wouldn't be the last one. Hull had lit the way forward, and the imitators were already sharpening their pencils in response. Success in Las Vegas has always attracted company the way a full picnic table attracts ants, and Thomas Hull's triumph didn't go unnoticed for very long at all. If one resort out on the empty highway could thrive this well, why couldn't another? The Last Frontier answered that exact question by opening right down the road the very next year, leaning hard into a romantic Old West theme complete with rustic wooden decor, and the pure fantasy of frontier adventure for tourists who wanted the danger without any of the actual risk involved. Slowly, resort by resort, that once barren highway began sprouting an entire chain of glowing desert oases, each one its own self-contained world of gambling, dining, and comfortable sleep. People started calling this stretch the Strip, and the name simply stuck. What had begun as a convenient shortcut through the sand was quickly becoming the main event. The Last Frontier leaned heavily into the theme business, and here we see another lasting Las Vegas instinct beginning to take clear shape. Rather than simply offering gambling and rooms, it sold visitors an entire fantasy, the romance of the Old West, all rustic wood and frontier flourishes throughout. Guests could pretend, for one glamorous weekend, that they'd stepped directly into some rugged tale of cowboys and dusty saloons, minus the dysentery, the actual gunfights, and the very real possibility of dying young out on the frontier. It was the Old West with full room service, danger you could comfortably admire from a plush chair. People absolutely adored it. This is a trick Las Vegas would go on to refine endlessly over the following decades, the fine art of selling a themed fantasy alongside the gambling itself. Give people a story to genuinely step inside, a world that feels meaningfully different from their ordinary daily lives, and the entire experience becomes far more intoxicating. You're no longer just losing money at a card table. You're a frontier adventurer, a high roller, a character living inside something considerably grander than your everyday existence. The theme is essentially the wrapping paper, and Las Vegas learned very early on that a gift feels far more exciting when it's beautifully wrapped, even when the gift itself amounts to a slow, cheerful emptying of your wallet. As more and more resorts joined this growing parade, that once empty stretch of Highway 91 began its full transformation into something with a real name and a genuine identity. Each new establishment functioned as its own complete little world, offering visitors everything they could possibly want without ever needing to step outside. Gambling indoors, dining indoors, sleeping indoors, swimming indoors. String enough of these self-contained oases together along a single road, and you end up with something genuinely remarkable, a corridor of pure pleasure blazing away in the desert night, each glowing outpost separated from the next by a stretch of dark scrubland. The nickname arrived naturally, the way all good nicknames tend to. People simply started calling this line of resorts the Strip, a simple, casual word that somehow captured the whole thing perfectly. A strip of highway, a strip of light, a strip of non-stop entertainment. The name stuck fast and hard, and it would eventually become one of the most recognizable words in all of American tourism. Not bad at all for a description of a road that most people had until recently considered essentially worthless. The deeper shift happening here is one of pure gravity. For years, downtown Fremont Street had been the undisputed heart of Las Vegas, the bright, glowing center around which everything else revolved. But the Strip was steadily pulling that center of gravity outward, toward the incoming crowds, toward the open land where a resort could sprawl as wide as its owner was willing to dream. Downtown was cramped, its lots small and its buildings packed tightly together. The Strip, by contrast, had room, endless desert room, space to build bigger and grander with each passing year. That freedom would prove absolutely decisive in the years ahead. Downtown didn't know it yet, but it was quietly being dethroned. The action, the money, the glamour, and the raw ambition were all migrating steadily out toward the highway, and they would never really come back. The Strip itself was still young and fairly modest at this stage, just a handful of themed resorts strung along a dusty road, but the trajectory was already firmly set. What had begun as a simple shortcut through the sand was steadily becoming the beating heart of the entire city. And the men who truly understood what this new frontier could eventually become were already quietly on their way, arriving in sharp suits with thick wallets and even quieter business interests. While the hoteliers dreamed about pools and neon signs, another kind of investor entirely was watching Las Vegas develop with keen, calculating eyes. Organized crime had spent years running illegal gambling operations back east, always glancing nervously over their shoulders, always just one raid away from complete ruin. And here was Nevada, offering the almost unbelievable gift of legal gambling, a place where the very activity that got you arrested in Chicago or New York was now blessed by the state itself and printed neatly on an official license. To these men, Las Vegas wasn't a vacation destination. It was a genuine opportunity, a chance to run their trade out in the open sunlight, laundering both money and reputation at the same time. They arrived quietly, wallets thick and smiles thin, and the town would spend the next several decades tangled up in their embrace. To understand why these men found Las Vegas so irresistible, you first have to appreciate the daily grief involved in running an illegal gambling operation everywhere else in the country. Back east, the games were genuinely profitable, but perpetually endangered. Every single night carried the risk of a sudden raid, the constant payoffs required to keep officials looking the other way, the arrests, the abrupt shutdowns, the endless grinding anxiety of running a lucrative business that the law could smash apart at any moment without warning. You made real money, certainly, but you made it with one eye permanently fixed on the door, forever bracing yourself for the knock that might come at any time. Now picture their reaction upon discovering Nevada. Here was an entire state that had taken the exact activity that made these men criminals everywhere else and stamped it fully legal. The dice they had once rolled in constant fear of prison could now be rolled openly inside a licensed establishment, complete with the government's official blessing. It must have seemed almost too good to be true, like a bank robber stumbling onto a town that had legalized bank robbery outright and started issuing permits for it. The very thing that had always kept them hunted was suddenly permitted, taxed, and even treated as respectable. Of course they came running. The appeal ran considerably deeper than simply avoiding police raids, though. A legal casino turned out to be a magnificent machine for solving a very particular problem these men had always faced, the problem of money that couldn't easily be explained to anyone. Illegal enterprises generate enormous piles of cash with absolutely no legitimate origin story attached to them. And cash you can't explain is cash you genuinely can't use for much of anything. But a casino, a casino is the perfect solution to exactly this problem. Mountains of money flow through it every single day, arriving from countless anonymous customers. Who's really in a position to say precisely how much the tables actually took in on any given night? Dirty money could stroll calmly in through the front door and walk right back out looking perfectly clean, and no one could easily prove otherwise. So they arrived, these investors in their sharp, tailored suits, quietly and without any real fanfare. They didn't announce themselves for what they truly were. They came dressed as ordinary businessmen, backers, financiers, men with real capital looking to invest in a promising new resort industry. And they happened to have exactly what the growing Strip needed most: money, enormous quantities of it, ready and willing to fund the ambitious dreams that respectable banks were far too nervous to touch with a 10-foot pole. A legitimate bank simply would not lend money to a casino. These men, on the other hand, would gladly lend, with interests that ran in considerably more directions than one. It was, in the end, a marriage of mutual need, and that mutual dependency is precisely what made the whole arrangement so durable over time. Las Vegas hungered desperately for investment capital to build its glittering future. These men possessed vast sums of untraceable cash and a burning desire to make it look legitimate. Each side had exactly what the other one required. The town got its much-needed funding. The men in sharp suits got their laundry service and a fully legal home base for their favorite trade. Neither party asked too many awkward questions, because awkward questions tend to be bad for everyone's business at once. This particular partnership would go on to define Las Vegas for decades, shaping its resorts, its money, its culture, and its shadows all at the same time. The town that had always carried a slightly disreputable air now bound itself quietly and profitably to men whose names you learned very quickly never to say out loud in polite company. It was, in many ways, a devil's bargain, but it built an entire city, and for a long stretch of years, the arrangement suited both sides beautifully. The sharp suits had finally found their promised land out in the meadows, and one of them in particular, a handsome, dangerous dreamer with a Hollywood tan, was about to arrive carrying a vision far grander than anyone else had ever dared to imagine before him. No single figure looms larger over early Las Vegas mythology than Benjamin Siegel, known, though never to his actual face, as Bugsy. Handsome, charming, volatile, and genuinely dangerous, Siegel was a mobster with a Hollywood tan, and a vision that consistently outran his own patience. He looked at the Strip and saw something entirely different from a cluster of rustic ranch-style resorts. He saw a place of genuine glamour, a luxurious palace rising out of the sand where movie stars and high rollers would rub shoulders together as equals. He poured himself completely into finishing and reimagining a struggling project called the Flamingo, obsessing over every single detail, every fixture, every impossibly expensive import. His dream was gorgeous. His budget was an absolute catastrophe, and the men funding him were not exactly known for their forgiveness when things went wrong. Siegel really was a genuinely compelling figure, the kind of man history loves to mythologize until the actual real person eventually vanishes behind the legend entirely. He was strikingly handsome, effortlessly charming, and moved comfortably among genuine Hollywood stars, blurring the line between gangster and celebrity in a way that fascinated absolutely everyone around him. He carried the looks of a leading man alongside the temper of a lit fuse, and that particular combination made him both magnetic and genuinely terrifying in roughly equal measure. People remembered meeting him for the rest of their lives. Some of them, quite understandably, wished they hadn't. What truly set Siegel apart from everyone else was the sheer scale of his personal ambition. The resorts along the Strip up to this point had been pleasant enough. Ranch-style places with swimming pools and Western charm, comfortable and reasonably profitable, and fundamentally modest in scope. Siegel looked at all of them and felt something close to genuine contempt. He didn't want comfortable and modest. He wanted real glamour, the kind that would draw actual movie stars and the genuinely wealthy out into the middle of the desert. He envisioned a true palace, a shimmering monument to pure luxury, a place so dazzling it would make the existing resorts look like the roadside cabins they essentially were in comparison. He found his canvas in the Flamingo, a struggling project he seized upon eagerly and reimagined as the vehicle for his own grand vision. And then he did exactly what obsessive dreamers always do. He obsessed over every last detail. Every element had to be absolutely perfect, every fixture the finest available anywhere, every material imported regardless of the cost or difficulty involved in getting it there. He wanted genuine luxury woven directly into the very bones of the building, and he refused to compromise on a single element of it. In a normal business situation, this kind of relentless perfectionism might actually be admirable. But when you're spending other people's money, and those particular people are the sort who settle disputes permanently, and without much discussion. It becomes something considerably closer to a death wish. Because that's the fatal flaw sitting right at the heart of this whole story. Siegel wasn't spending his own personal fortune on the Flamingo. He was spending money supplied entirely by his associates, the men in sharp suits, who naturally expected a solid return on their investment, and expected it reasonably soon. Siegel's obsession sent the total cost spiraling upward with genuinely terrifying speed. Every imported fixture, every last-minute design change, every insistence on absolute perfection added another line to a bill that grew and grew until it towered over the original estimates like some kind of monster. The dream itself was gorgeous. The numbers behind it were an absolute nightmare. Here we find the timeless tension sitting right at the center of the entire tale. Art versus arithmetic. Vision versus the patience of genuinely dangerous men. Siegel sincerely believed he was building something magnificent, something that would fully justify every dollar spent once the world finally saw it. And in a certain sense, he was actually right, because the vision he chased, of Las Vegas as a true place of glamour, would eventually come to pass and make an enormous number of people extraordinarily wealthy. But visions take real time to prove themselves, and time was precisely the one thing Siegel's backers were disinclined to grant him, especially as the costs kept climbing and the whispers began to spread through the wider organization. You can feel the coming tragedy building even as the walls of the Flamingo went up brick by brick. A charismatic man, a beautiful dream, a mountain of borrowed money, and a group of investors whose displeasure was absolutely not the sort of thing you survived simply by apologizing sincerely. Siegel was pouring his entire soul into the Flamingo, betting everything he had on the idea that spectacle would eventually pay off in the end. It was a magnificent gamble, genuinely fitting for the very town he was helping to build from nothing. But in Las Vegas, the house usually wins, and Siegel was about to discover, in the worst possible way, that his own backers considered themselves the house in this particular arrangement. The Flamingo finally opened its doors the day after Christmas in 1946, and by almost every measure, it was a genuine flop. A sudden storm grounded the celebrity flight Siegel had been counting on to provide instant glamour for opening night. The hotel rooms weren't even fully finished yet, and the gamblers who did manage to show up had the sheer audacity to actually win, draining the tables instead of feeding them the way they were supposed to. Siegel had spent a genuinely staggering fortune, far more than he'd originally promised, and his backers were already beginning to whisper the kind of pointed questions that simply don't have safe answers attached to them. The opening night itself was a disaster of almost comic proportions, the sort of night where everything that could possibly go wrong lined up politely and took its turn one after another. Siegel had staked his grand debut entirely on a glittering crowd of Hollywood stars flying in specifically to lend the Flamingo instant glamour, the celebrity sparkle meant to announce his new palace to the entire world. Then, the weather intervened without any warning at all. A storm rolled through and grounded the incoming flights, and the stars Siegel had been counting on simply never arrived. The entire centerpiece of his big night evaporated into the clouds, leaving him to open his dream to a crowd that was conspicuously short on the dazzle he'd promised everyone. It only got worse from there. The hotel rooms, the entire point of building a proper destination resort in the first place, weren't even finished yet, which meant the visitors who did show up had absolutely nowhere to actually stay the night. They could gamble for a while, certainly, but then they had to leave, taking whatever potential losses they might have accumulated elsewhere with them. A casino wants you to stay, to linger comfortably, to keep playing well past the hour when good judgment normally goes to sleep. An unfinished hotel, by contrast, sends your customers straight out the door right when the night should be getting genuinely expensive for them. And then came the final indignity, the one that must have felt like the universe was mocking Siegel personally. The gamblers who did show up, the ones actually playing at his beautiful new tables, had the sheer nerve to win. The dice fell their way that night. The cards smiled generously on them, and money flowed steadily out of the casino instead of into it. Over the long run, of course, the house always wins eventually. That's simple mathematical law. But on any single given night, luck can absolutely swing against the casino, and on Siegel's cursed opening night, it swung hard against him. Put it all together, the missing celebrities, the unfinished rooms, the gamblers walking away richer than they arrived, and the Flamingo's opening was an unambiguous, undeniable flop. For most failed businesses, a disaster like this simply means bankruptcy, embarrassment, and a quiet, sad closing. For Siegel, it meant something far more dangerous, because he had lost not his own personal money, but the money belonging to men who did not accept losses gracefully or quietly. To his genuine credit, Siegel didn't simply surrender and walk away. He closed the resort temporarily, regrouped his efforts, worked hard to finish what he'd started, and reopened the doors with the hotel now actually complete. And here's the bittersweet twist that turns this story from a simple business failure into something genuinely tragic. It actually began to work. Slowly but steadily, the Flamingo started finding its footing. The numbers began to genuinely improve. The vision Siegel had bet everything on was, against considerable odds, starting to prove itself correct after all. Given just a little more time, this palace in the sand might well have become exactly the triumph Siegel had originally imagined for it. But time was precisely what he no longer had available to him. His backers had watched him burn through an absolute fortune, had endured the humiliating public flop, had run entirely out of the patience that was never particularly abundant to begin with. In their own private arithmetic, the early signs of recovery did nothing to erase the enormous debt of trust Siegel had squandered along the way. The dream itself was finally turning around. The dreamer, however, had run out his string completely. In June of 1947, Benjamin Siegel was sitting on a couch inside a Beverly Hills home, quietly reading a newspaper, when the window beside him suddenly shattered, and a volley of gunfire ended his life instantly. No one was ever formally convicted for the killing, and honestly, no one really needed to be. The message was unmistakably clear, and it echoed all the way back to the desert. Within moments of the news reaching Las Vegas, his former associates calmly walked straight into the Flamingo and announced that they were now in charge of the operation. The killing itself carried a certain grim, deliberate theater to it. Siegel wasn't ambushed in some dark alley somewhere, or quietly disappeared out into the desert never to be found again. He was shot directly through the window of a comfortable Beverly Hills home while sitting on his own couch, reading the evening paper. An ordinary, domestic moment suddenly shattered by deliberate violence. The setting itself was clearly the point. This wasn't a killing meant to be hidden away from view. It was a public statement, delivered in a nice, respectable neighborhood, in a manner impossible for anyone to ignore or misinterpret. That no one was ever formally convicted surprises absolutely no one who understands how this particular world actually operated. Convictions require witnesses willing to talk openly, and in these particular circles, talking to authorities was very much its own form of suicide. The killing was almost certainly ordered by the very same associates who had originally funded the Flamingo, their patience with Siegel's increasingly costly obsession finally, completely exhausted, but actually proving that, let alone punishing it, was never realistically going to happen. The detail that reveals absolutely everything, that tells you precisely what kind of world this truly was, is what happened immediately afterward back in Las Vegas. Within moments of the news arriving, associates simply walked into the Flamingo and announced they were now running the place going forward. Not a single pause for grief, not a decent interval of mourning observed, not even one day of respectful silence granted. The body was barely cold before the resort changed hands with brisk, businesslike calm. It was the coldest possible proof imaginable that Siegel had always been little more than a means to an end. The dream itself was never really his to begin with. The men behind him had simply been waiting patiently to collect what was theirs, And yet, in death, Sigel achieved something he'd never quite managed to achieve in life: a full transformation into genuine legend. The messy, unflattering truth that he was a violent, obsessive man who overspent wildly and ultimately got himself killed for it, gradually softened over the years into a far more romantic tale. In the endless retelling, Sigel became the visionary founder, the doomed dreamer who single-handedly imagined all of Las Vegas and then died for his beautiful ambition. It's a considerably better story than the actual reality. It's also, for the most part, complete nonsense, a myth polished smooth by decades of repeated retelling until all the sharp, ugly facts eventually wore away entirely. The truth, as it almost always turns out to be, is far more crowded and considerably less flattering than the legend suggests. Sigel didn't actually build Las Vegas single-handedly. The railroad helped build it. So did the dam, the state legislature, Thomas Hull, and countless other people who came before and after him in this long chain of events. The Strip was already rising steadily when Sigel first arrived on the scene, and it would have kept rising even had he never shown up at all. He was one colorful figure among many, more memorable than most certainly, but hardly the lone genius that the popular legend insists he was. What Sigel's death truly settled, beyond any reasonable doubt, was the simple question of exactly who ran the Strip going forward. The men in sharp suits had just demonstrated, in about the most vivid way imaginable, that they controlled this entire town completely. They could fund a resort, install a convenient frontman, and then remove him with a volley of bullets the very instant he became inconvenient, all without facing any real consequences whatsoever. The flamingo passed smoothly into their waiting hands, and the message rippled steadily outward to everyone involved in the business. Las Vegas now belonged to them, unambiguously, and with their control firmly established, and their unfortunate frontman conveniently transformed into a martyr, they settled comfortably into running their golden desert town exactly as they pleased, using a quiet, elegant little trick that would eventually make them far richer than Sigel had ever even dared to dream. Now we arrive at the quiet mechanism that truly made the entire mob era spin, a trick so simple and so lucrative that it's almost admirable in its sheer nerve. It was called the skim. Inside any casino, mountains of physical cash flow through the counting rooms every single day without fail. And if you happen to control that particular room, you can simply take a portion of it off the top before anyone ever gets around to writing down the official total. The taxman sees only the smaller reported number. The hidden mountains of untaxed cash, meanwhile, get quietly packed into suitcases and carried straight back to bosses waiting patiently in distant cities. It was theft with essentially no victim who would ever think to complain. Invisible, elegant, and genuinely enormous in scale. To fully appreciate the skim, you first have to appreciate the sheer tidal wave of cash that pours continuously through any casino. This is a business built almost entirely around physical money. Coins and bills changing hands thousands upon thousands of times every single day. Flowing steadily from customers to gaming tables to cashier cages to counting rooms in one continuous, ceaseless green river. There were no credit cards back, then tracing every single transaction. No digital records tallying up each individual dollar. Just enormous quantities of anonymous cash moving far too quickly for any outside observer to reliably follow. In a world structured like that, the person who controls the count effectively controls the truth, because the count itself is the only real record of how much money there ever actually was in the first place. And that's the entire trick, genuinely breathtaking in its underlying simplicity. Before anyone officially recorded how much the casino had actually earned that day, before the total ever made its way into the books that government tax officials would eventually examine, someone working in the counting room simply set aside a certain portion of the cash. A cut taken off the very top, skimmed away like cream, removed entirely from the count before that count was ever formally recorded anywhere. The official number, the one eventually reported to the government, reflected only whatever remained after the skim had already been taken. The rest had already vanished quietly into suitcases, untaxed, unrecorded, and essentially untraceable by anyone. Think for a moment about how genuinely elegant this is as a crime, and I use the word elegant here with a certain reluctant respect. There's no real victim left to raise any alarm. The gamblers lost their money fairly at the tables, exactly as they always expected they might. The casino itself still turned a healthy reported profit and dutifully paid its taxes on that reported amount. Everything looked completely legitimate from the outside looking in. The only party actually being cheated here was the government itself, deprived of taxes on money it never even knew existed in the first place, and the government obviously couldn't miss what it had never actually seen. The suitcases themselves are the detail that really brings this whole scheme vividly to life. The skimmed cash, those untaxed mountains quietly removed before the official count, got physically packed up and carried straight out of Las Vegas to the waiting bosses in distant cities across the country. Real money, in real bags, hauled openly across state lines to men who never once showed their faces anywhere near an actual casino floor. The resorts of the Strip had effectively become engines pumping untaxed cash toward hidden owners far away, and the whole elaborate operation hummed along in plain sight, disguised as perfectly ordinary, legal, and profitable business. This is really the secret sitting at the very heart of the entire mob era, the thing that reveals what Las Vegas truly was underneath its glittering surface during these years. On the outside, it looked like an entertainment town, a place built around glamorous shows, exciting gambling, and endless glamorous nights out. Underneath all of that, though, its most important function was actually serving as a machine for generating and carefully hiding untaxed cash. The games, the lights, the entire dazzling spectacle were, in a very real sense, the elaborate cover story for the real business quietly happening back in the counting rooms. The point was never really the roulette wheel itself. The point was always the money that flowed steadily past it and then quietly disappeared. For a long, profitable stretch of years, this particular arrangement worked absolutely beautifully, an invisible fortune bleeding steadily out of Las Vegas, night after night after night. But the same secrecy that made the skim so wildly lucrative also, inevitably, made the entire town a genuine target for outside attention. And eventually, the wider world would grow very curious indeed about exactly who was doing all this counting. For now, though, the cash kept flowing steadily, the suitcases kept filling up, and on the surface, Las Vegas simply appeared to get more glamorous with each passing year. By the 1950s, Las Vegas had figured out that gambling alone simply wasn't enough to keep the crowds consistently coming back. To sustain real growth, you needed genuine dazzle, and nobody delivered dazzle quite like the entertainers who made the Strip their personal playground. At the very heart of this new era stood the Sands, and at the heart of the Sands stood Frank Sinatra and his loose, legendary crew of close friends. When Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and the rest of the group took the stage together, the entire town seemed to physically lean in and pay attention. They sang, they joked around, they drank, and they blurred the line between the formal show and an informal party, until the audience genuinely felt like invited guests at the greatest late-night gathering in all of America. This was Las Vegas at its coolest, most effortless, and most thoroughly untouchable, and it sold a fantasy that money could rent for an entire weekend at a time. The realization that gambling alone wasn't sufficient marks a genuine turning point in the town's overall thinking. The gaming tables would always remain the true business at the mathematical heart of everything, where the actual money was made. But tables alone are a genuinely hard sell as a reason to cross an entire desert. Plenty of other places had gambling available. What Las Vegas specifically needed was a compelling reason to choose Las Vegas over anywhere else, a magnet considerably stronger than the simple opportunity to lose some money at a card table. That particular magnet turned out to be entertainment itself, and not just any entertainment, but the most electric, glamorous, genuinely unmissable performances available anywhere in America. The Sands became the true crown jewel of this entirely new strategy, and it earned that status largely through one man and his truly remarkable circle of close friends. When Frank Sinatra held court there on any given night, something happened that genuinely transcended what an ordinary concert could ever offer. Sinatra wasn't merely a talented singer. He embodied a certain kind of mid-century cool, effortless, confident, just a little bit dangerous, impossibly stylish in every regard. To watch him perform live was to brush directly up against a fantasy of adult sophistication that most people could otherwise only ever dream about inhabiting for themselves. But the true magic really ignited whenever Sinatra shared the stage with his crew, that loose and thoroughly legendary gang of performers who seemed to genuinely delight in one another's company night after night. When they appeared together on stage, the entire show transformed into something no carefully rehearsed performance could ever hope to match. They sang beautifully, yes, but they also joked constantly, teased each other mercilessly, and wandered casually through the evening with drinks in hand, letting the audience feel as though they'd somehow stumbled into the very best party imaginable. The line between polished, formal performance and spontaneous, genuine fun completely dissolved, and what remained afterward was pure, intoxicating charm. That particular blurring effect was really the secret ingredient, the thing that made these specific nights so genuinely legendary among everyone who attended. An ordinary show typically maintains a clear wall between the performers up on stage and the crowd watching below, a firm divide separating those performing from those simply observing. Sinatra and his friends knocked that entire wall down completely. They made the audience feel genuinely included, like invited guests rather than distant spectators, like they'd been personally invited to the single coolest gathering happening anywhere in the entire country. People didn't just watch these particular shows. They felt like they had genuinely lived through them, and they carried that feeling home afterward like a personal trophy, telling absolutely everyone they knew about the incredible night they'd spent among the truly beautiful people. This is precisely the fantasy Las Vegas eventually learned to sell so effectively. And it was a genuine masterstroke, because it was a fantasy literally anyone could rent for the price of a single weekend. You didn't need to be an actual movie star or a millionaire to feel like one, if only for a night. You simply had to travel to the Strip, buy a ticket, put on your very best clothes, and step directly into the glamour waiting for you. For a little while, you could genuinely inhabit a world of sophistication and excitement utterly unlike your ordinary life back home. Las Vegas packaged that transformation carefully and sold it to anyone willing to pay for it, and people lined up eagerly, more than willing to buy in. And of course, the entire dazzling spectacle ultimately served the true business waiting patiently nearby the whole time. The shows drew the crowds in. The crowds arrived thoroughly dazzled and loosened up, eager to spend freely, and the gaming tables collected their winnings exactly as they always had. Entertainment was never really a distraction from the gambling itself. It was the glittering bait that made the gambling possible in the first place, the lure that pulled people across an entire desert and put them squarely in a mood generous enough to keep on playing. Sinatra sold the fantasy. The house happily cashed it in afterward. It was a partnership every bit as profitable as it was genuinely glamorous, and it came to define the golden age of the Strip. But the singers were only ever part of the larger spectacle taking shape during these years. Alongside the crooners, another entirely different kind of show was steadily rising, one built almost entirely around feathers, sequins, and pure escapist excess. While the headline performers crooned away, another form of entertainment was quietly becoming just as essential to the overall Las Vegas identity: the grand stage spectacle. Drawing inspiration from the extravagant stage revues of Paris, the resorts began mounting genuinely enormous productions featuring elaborate costumes, towering feathered headdresses, and precisely choreographed glamour on a scale rarely seen anywhere else. These shows existed purely for escapism, a shimmering fantasy carefully designed to make a visitor from some quiet, ordinary town feel, for one dazzling evening at least, like they'd stepped directly into a world completely without limits. The spectacle itself was really the entire point. Everything about Las Vegas, the lights, the shows, the endlessly flowing free drinks, existed purely to loosen you up, to keep you dreaming pleasantly, and to gently guide you back toward the tables, where the real transaction was always quietly waiting. The original inspiration came from across the ocean, from those lavish stage revues of Paris that had long dazzled European audiences with their sheer extravagance. Las Vegas took that basic idea, that established tradition of grand theatrical spectacle, and did exactly what Las Vegas always tends to do with any good idea. It made the whole thing considerably bigger. Where Paris had traditionally offered refined elegance, the Strip offered overwhelming abundance instead, productions so enormous and ornately detailed that they threatened to burst right through the very stages built to contain them. Restraint was never really the Las Vegas way of doing things. Pure excess was always the entire point, and these spectacle shows embraced that excess with open, welcoming arms. Picture exactly what a typical visitor actually saw, because the finer details really are half the magic here. Costumes absolutely dripping with sequins that caught and threw light in 1,000 different directions at once. Towering feathered headdresses so tall and elaborate that they seemed to genuinely defy the performer's own ability to stand upright while wearing them. Long rows of dancers moving through flawless, precise choreography, every single step timed down to absolute perfection. The entire stage functioning as one living machine of glamour and constant motion. It was pure sensory overload, but in the very best possible way, a genuine flood of color and movement and shimmer specifically designed to leave the audience utterly slack-jawed with delight. For someone visiting from an ordinary town somewhere, it genuinely felt like a vision beamed in from another planet entirely. Consider carefully who actually filled these audience seats night after night. Visitors from quiet, unremarkable places, from small towns and modest cities everywhere, people whose daily lives typically ran on routine and careful restraint. They arrived in Las Vegas coming directly from a world built around the ordinary, and these spectacle shows dropped them instantly into a fantasy of seemingly limitless abundance. For one truly dazzling evening, they got to sit inside a genuine dream, surrounded by more glamour and excess than their entire hometown might see in a full decade. The show itself whispered a seductive, powerful promise that here, in this particular place, life carried no real limits and every extravagance imaginable was suddenly possible. That feeling, that intoxicating sense of stepping directly into a world without rules or restraint, was really the product Las Vegas was truly selling underneath everything else. The spectacle existed to genuinely transform a visitor's entire state of mind, to lift them out of their careful, everyday selves and into someone considerably freer, someone who might do things they'd never normally do back home, someone who might, for instance, wager more freely than good sense would ordinarily allow. The shows were carefully engineered to loosen you up, to gradually melt away the caution and thrift that governed your normal life and replace them instead with a giddy sense of endless possibility. Because everything happening in Las Vegas, every last dazzling element, served one single, quiet purpose. The blazing lights, the legendary shows, the drinks flowing freely and cheaply, the entire overwhelming sensory feast, all of it was designed carefully to guide you gently but surely right back toward the gaming tables. Loosen a person up sufficiently, fill them with wonder and free-flowing liquor, and the electric feeling that absolutely anything is possible, and they naturally become a far more generous gambler. The spectacle itself was never really the end goal. It was the elaborate, gorgeous machinery of persuasion, all of it pointed carefully toward the exact same destination. This is really the deep genius of the town, the thing that separated it from being merely a collection of gambling halls scattered across the desert. Las Vegas understood, perhaps better than anywhere else, that people don't part with their money easily when they feel cautious and clear-headed. So it built an entire environment specifically engineered to dissolve that caution, a total experience of dazzle and pleasure and abundance that put visitors in exactly the mood needed to keep playing longer than they'd originally planned. The feathers and sequins were never simply decoration. They were tools, beautiful instruments deployed within a grand and genuinely profitable scheme. You came for the wonder of it all. You stayed for the fantasy. And the house collected steadily while you dreamed away the evening. And just when you might think this town couldn't possibly get any stranger in its relentless pursuit of new crowds, it somehow found a way to turn even nuclear weapons into a genuine tourist attraction. Here's a chapter of this story so strange it genuinely sounds invented, and yet it's entirely, verifiably real. Just a short drive north of the Strip sat a government testing site where the military regularly detonated actual atomic bombs. And rather than hiding in fear, Las Vegas threw a party instead. Throughout the 1950s, mushroom clouds rose visibly along the horizon, and the city leaned into the spectacle with cheerful, almost bewildering enthusiasm. Hotels openly advertised the blast schedules to guests, rooftops filled with tourists sipping atomic-themed cocktails, and the entire surreal spectacle was marketed as a can't-miss attraction for visitors. Only Las Vegas could look directly at a nuclear explosion and see, first and foremost, a genuine opportunity to sell more drinks. It remains one of the single most audacious tourism campaigns in the entire history of anywhere on Earth. Let's be perfectly clear about the actual facts here, because they genuinely strain belief even now. A short drive from the glittering Strip, the federal government had established a dedicated site for testing nuclear weapons, and test them it did, detonating actual atomic bombs out in the open desert. These weren't quiet, hidden affairs conducted in secret. The explosions were powerful enough that their signature mushroom clouds rose visibly above the horizon, plainly visible from within the city itself. Las Vegas, in other words, had a genuine front row seat to nuclear weapons testing, close enough that residents and tourists alike could watch the clouds bloom directly over the desert. Now, a sensible town confronted with regular nuclear detonations happening in its own backyard might reasonably feel a certain understandable unease about the whole situation. It might worry about safety, about radioactive fallout, about the sheer strangeness of living beside a place where the most destructive weapons ever devised were being actively tested. Las Vegas felt essentially none of this, or at least admitted to none of it publicly. Instead, with a boldness that genuinely borders on the deranged, the town looked squarely at the rising mushroom clouds and saw, of all things, an opportunity. It saw, quite literally, a marketing hook. Where any other reasonable place would flee, Las Vegas sold tickets. The city leaned into all of this with an enthusiasm that honestly has to be admired, even as it thoroughly baffles anyone hearing about it today. Hotels genuinely advertised the blast schedules openly, letting guests know precisely when to look up for the next scheduled detonation, effectively turning a weapons test into a scheduled evening attraction, much like a nightly stage show. Rooftops and terraces filled steadily with tourists gathering together, drinks firmly in hand, treating these distant nuclear explosions as spectacular entertainment. The town actually invented atomic-themed cocktails specifically to commemorate the occasion, because of course it did exactly that, and the whole surreal scene became a genuine selling point for visitors. Come to Las Vegas, gamble a little, catch a great show, and watch an actual atomic bomb detonate over breakfast. The sheer audacity of it all is almost beautiful in its own strange way. Picture the scene clearly in your mind. Tourists lounging comfortably on a hotel rooftop in the early morning hours, sipping a specially named cocktail, chatting and laughing together, and then pausing collectively to watch a mushroom cloud rise silently over the desert horizon in the distance. Applause, perhaps, from the assembled crowd. Another round of drinks ordered immediately afterward. It's an image so strange, so uniquely Las Vegas in character, that it genuinely could belong to no other place on Earth. Only this particular town could take humanity's single most terrifying invention and fold it seamlessly into a pleasant morning of casual tourism. What this reveals, beneath all the dark comedy involved, is the essential character of Las Vegas itself. Its bottomless, genuinely shameless genius for turning absolutely anything at all into a marketable attraction. Most places recognize certain limits, subjects considered too grim or too frightening to ever package as entertainment. Las Vegas, it seems, recognized no such limits whatsoever. If a particular thing drew attention and drew paying crowds, this town would find some way to sell it, with moral and existential considerations firmly set aside in favor of the far more pressing question of exactly how to move more drinks. Nuclear testing was simply the most extreme possible proof of a talent this city had always possessed in abundance. It stands today as perhaps the most audacious tourism campaign in the recorded history of anywhere on Earth, a perfect and slightly horrifying distillation of exactly what makes Las Vegas what it fundamentally is. This town has never once been troubled by good taste, by genuine restraint, or by any sense that certain things simply ought not to be commercialized for profit. It looked squarely at an atomic bomb and immediately thought of cocktails instead. That particular instinct, relentless and shameless and weirdly magnificent all at once, is the exact same one that built this entire improbable city out of empty desert sand in the first place. And it would go on serving Las Vegas extremely well as the town grew ever larger, hungrier, and considerably more expensive to build, requiring rivers of fresh money that would soon flow from a source almost as surprising as the bombs detonating out on the horizon. As the resorts along the Strip grew steadily grander in scope, they needed access to something the mob simply couldn't always supply from their suitcases alone: vast sums of genuinely borrowable money. And respectable banks everywhere wanted absolutely nothing to do with financing casinos. Into that particular gap stepped a remarkably unlikely financier, the pension fund of a massive national labor union, an enormous pool of ordinary workers' retirement savings that quietly ended up funding resort after resort along the entire Strip. The arrangement suited absolutely everyone tangled up in it. The union controlled truly enormous amounts of capital. The casino operators desperately needed loans that no one else would reasonably provide them. And the connections running between these two groups ran deep and considerably shadowy. For a long stretch of years, some of the most famous buildings ever constructed in Las Vegas rose directly on the backs of everyday laborers who never once knew that their own futures were quietly bankrolling all that neon out in the desert. The core problem facing the growing Strip was fundamentally one of scale. Suitcases full of skimmed cash could certainly fund a great deal of construction, but the ambitions driving Las Vegas forward were ballooning considerably faster than any suitcase could realistically keep pace with. Building a single grand resort cost genuinely staggering amounts of money, far more than even a thriving skim operation could reliably provide on its own. And the town's collective dreams just kept getting bigger with each passing year. What the resort operators desperately needed was the straightforward ability to borrow money, to take out enormous loans the exact same way any other large legitimate business routinely does. And there they hit a wall as solid and immovable as any casino vault ever built. Respectable banks, understandably, wanted absolutely nothing to do with financing Las Vegas casinos in any capacity. To a legitimate lending institution, a casino represented a genuine nightmare of financial risk and reputational damage, an enterprise deeply tangled up with men whose names regularly appeared in law enforcement files, running an entire industry built almost entirely on cash and shadow. No proper, reputable bank would touch that kind of business with a barge pole. Lending money to a mob-connected casino was a genuinely reliable way for any banker to ruin his entire career and possibly attract the unwanted attention of people he'd much rather avoid entirely. So the ordinary channels of legitimate finance slammed firmly shut, and the Strip found itself desperately cash-hungry, with nowhere legitimate left to turn for help. Into this particular gap stepped one of the most improbable financiers imaginable in the entire story. The pension fund belonging to an enormous national labor union. Picture for a moment exactly what that fund actually represented. A vast pool of money set carefully aside for the eventual retirement of countless ordinary working people across the country, hard-earned savings meant to carry laborers safely into their old age. It was a genuine mountain of available capital, and crucially, it was controlled by people who were willing to lend money precisely where respectable banks had refused. When the casino operators came looking for financing, this particular pension fund opened its coffers and began quietly writing the loans that literally no one else would provide. And so, resort by resort, the famous buildings that came to define the Strip rose steadily on borrowed retirement money belonging to ordinary workers. The connections between the union's leadership and the men actually running the casinos ran deep and genuinely murky, a tangled web of mutual favor and shared interest that kept the necessary money flowing steadily in one direction. It was an arrangement that suited absolutely everyone seated at the table. The casino operators received the enormous loans they desperately needed to keep building. The people controlling the pension fund received influence, financial returns, and whatever quieter benefits naturally flowed from being so genuinely useful to such powerful friends. Each party held exactly what the other one lacked, and both sides were perfectly happy to keep all the finer details safely tucked away in shadow. There's something genuinely striking, and honestly a little troubling, in the full picture this paints of the era. Some of the most glamorous, famous structures ever constructed anywhere in America, true temples of light and excess and indulgence, rose directly on the foundation of ordinary workers' retirement savings. The laborers whose money bankrolled all that Neon had, in almost every single case, absolutely no idea this was happening. They went to work each day, paid faithfully into their pensions, and trusted that their savings sat safely somewhere sensible, never once dreaming that their own futures were quietly underwriting roulette wheels and feathered showgirls out in the middle of the Nevada desert. It's one more layer in the strange, deeply tangled financing story of Las Vegas, one more example of how the glittering surface concealed a far more complicated reality underneath it all. The town had run on hidden money from its very beginning, skimmed cash and shadow loans and arrangements that would never have survived exposure to genuine daylight. The Union pension era simply extended that same tradition further, funding the boom through channels that respectable society generally preferred not to examine too closely. It worked beautifully for a considerable time, as these particular arrangements always seem to, but hidden money inevitably attracts unwanted attention eventually, and the ever-growing spectacle of Las Vegas was steadily becoming far too large and far too curious an object to escape the notice of the one force powerful enough to eventually change everything. Washington itself was beginning to wonder exactly who was truly running this entire show. It simply couldn't stay a secret forever. As Las Vegas swelled into a genuine national fascination, federal investigators grew increasingly interested in figuring out exactly who was running the show behind the scenes. Dramatic Senate hearings put organized crime on full public display for the entire country to see, forcing deeply uncomfortable questions about the hidden ownership lurking behind all these glittering resorts. Suddenly, the town that had thrived so comfortably in the shadows found itself squinting uncomfortably under a genuine national spotlight. The pressure didn't shut Las Vegas down entirely, not even remotely close, but it made absolutely everyone involved genuinely nervous, and it planted a crucial idea firmly in the minds of the state officials who depended so heavily on gambling revenue to fund their government. If Nevada wanted to keep its golden goose alive and healthy going forward, it would eventually need to find some way to pry the town loose from the grip of men who could never realistically pass an honest background check. The trouble with becoming genuinely famous, of course, is that fame inevitably draws eyes, and not all of those eyes turn out to be friendly ones. For years, Las Vegas had thrived precisely because it operated within a comfortable, protective dimness, its true ownership carefully obscured, its money flowing steadily through channels that nobody examined too closely. That arrangement worked wonderfully well as long as the town remained merely a distant curiosity to the rest of the country. But Las Vegas had grown into a genuine national fascination by this point, splashed regularly across magazines and newsreels in a way that became increasingly impossible to ignore. And whenever something becomes that famous, people occupying real positions of power inevitably start asking exactly who's behind it all. Federal investigators turned out to be among the most curious of all, and they didn't particularly care for the answers they kept finding as they dug deeper. The more thoroughly they looked into things, the clearer it became that the glittering resorts lining the Strip were deeply entangled with organized crime, that the men actually profiting most weren't the respectable businessmen whose names appeared on the official licenses, but rather figures operating from a very different world entirely. This wasn't the sort of thing the federal government could simply continue overlooking once it had been thoroughly dragged into public view. And drag it into the light, they most certainly did, through dramatic, widely covered public hearings that put this entire shadowy business on full national display for everyone to see. Those hearings represented a genuine spectacle in their own right, and a genuine problem for Las Vegas going forward. Suddenly, the hidden machinery driving this entire town was being openly discussed before the whole watching nation. Uncomfortable questions hung heavily in the air about exactly who owned what, where all the money was actually going, and how deep these various criminal connections genuinely ran throughout the industry. The comfortable protective shadow that had shielded Las Vegas for so many years evaporated almost entirely under the harsh glare of this sudden national attention. The town found itself squinting uncomfortably in a spotlight it had never particularly wanted, its long-held secrets pulled out into the open air for absolutely everyone to examine and judge for themselves. Now it would make for a tidy story to simply say this scrutiny shut Las Vegas down completely, but that's genuinely not what happened here, not even remotely close to it. The town was simply far too profitable, far too deeply entrenched, far too useful to too many powerful people to just collapse under the weight of a few uncomfortable hearings. The lights stayed on. The tables kept running steadily. The crowds kept arriving in droves. What all this pressure actually accomplished was considerably more subtle, but ultimately far more important in the long run. It made absolutely everyone involved genuinely nervous. It signaled clearly that the old way of doing business, all shadow and skim and outright criminal ownership, was now living on distinctly borrowed time. And it planted a crucial idea in the minds of the people who mattered most to the town's long-term future, the state officials of Nevada itself. These particular officials held a powerful personal stake in the fate of Las Vegas, because gambling revenue had by this point become the golden goose of the entire state's economy, filling public coffers and directly funding the government's day-to-day operations. They didn't want to see Las Vegas destroyed in any sense. They wanted it saved and protected going forward. But they could see quite plainly that federal patience wasn't infinite, and that the criminal ownership hanging heavily over the town represented a genuine threat to this entire lucrative arrangement. Something would clearly have to change if this particular goose was going to keep laying golden eggs for the state indefinitely. The realization slowly crystallizing in these official minds was both practical and genuinely stark. If Nevada truly wished to protect its single most valuable industry, it needed to find some workable way to pry Las Vegas loose from the grip of men who could never realistically survive an honest background check. The mob had, admittedly, built this town and made it genuinely profitable. But the mob had now become a serious liability, a magnet drawing exactly the kind of federal attention that threatened to endanger absolutely everything the state had built. The state needed new owners entirely, respectable owners this time, the sort whose names could appear openly in the newspaper without automatically triggering a federal investigation. The problem itself was abundantly clear. The actual solution, though, remained considerably less obvious, at least for the time being. And then, in the strangest possible way imaginable, the solution came wheeling quietly into town in the dead of night and simply refused to leave afterward. The strangest possible savior imaginable arrived in 1966, wheeled quietly into town under cover of darkness, and he would go on to not leave his hotel room again for years afterward. Howard Hughes, the famously reclusive aviation tycoon and one of the wealthiest men alive at the time, took up residence in the penthouse suite of the Desert Inn and simply never checked out again. When the hotel's owners eventually asked him politely to leave, he solved the entire problem in about the most Howard Hughes way conceivable. He simply bought the whole hotel outright. Then he went on to buy another one, and then another after that, spending an eccentric fortune to gobble up resort after resort along the Strip. A germ-fearing, deeply isolated billionaire had somehow become the single largest casino owner in all of Las Vegas, all without ever once setting foot on an actual casino floor. It was genuinely bizarre, and it turned out to be exactly what the town desperately needed at that particular moment. Howard Hughes was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most peculiar figures of his entire era, a man whose life genuinely reads like fiction, someone who seemed almost too strange for reality itself. He had been a dashing aviator in his younger years, a successful Hollywood producer, and an industrialist of truly enormous wealth, one of the richest men alive anywhere in the world. But by the time he finally arrived in Las Vegas, he had already retreated deep into a profound and eccentric reclusiveness, a germ-fearing recluse who actively shrank from any human contact whatsoever out in the wider world. His arrival in this particular town suited his considerable strangeness perfectly. He came in under the cover of darkness, wheeled quietly into the Desert Inn, hidden carefully from public view, a virtual phantom taking up residence in a top-floor penthouse suite. And then, having checked himself in, he simply never left again. Hughes settled into that penthouse and stayed there, and stayed, and stayed, sealed entirely away in his private rooms, refusing to ever emerge into the world outside. This created an amusing practical problem, because the hotel naturally had every reasonable expectation that a guest would eventually depart and free up that valuable suite for other paying customers. When the owners finally suggested it might be time for Mr. Hughes to check out, they discovered rather quickly that this particular guest simply didn't think like other people at all. His solution to being politely asked to leave was gloriously, absurdly direct. He bought the entire hotel outright, the whole Desert Inn purchased in full, so that no one could ever again suggest he vacate a room he now personally owned. It's the sort of move available only to a man possessing a truly staggering personal fortune and a genuinely eccentric mind, the ultimate power play from someone who apparently found it considerably easier to purchase an entire building than to simply pack a suitcase and move elsewhere. And having discovered exactly how simple it was to solve his problems this particular way, Hughes didn't stop there at all. He went on to buy another resort, and then another after that, spending his vast personal wealth to steadily gobble up property after property along the Strip in a genuine buying spree that ultimately reshaped the entire town. Consider the wonderful absurdity buried in this whole result. Howard Hughes, sealed away permanently in his penthouse, terrified of ordinary germs, actively shunning all human contact, somehow became the single largest casino owner anywhere in Las Vegas. He commanded an entire empire of gambling and glamour, of gaming tables and showrooms and endless neon, and he managed to do all of it without ever once setting foot on any of his own casino floors. He never strolled through his own resorts, never once watched the dice roll across his own tables, never saw any of the shows or personally greeted any of the crowds. He owned the beating commercial heart of the entire strip from behind a permanently locked door. A ghost landlord quietly ruling over a kingdom he steadfastly refused to even look at directly. It was bizarre almost beyond words, and yet it turned out to be precisely, almost miraculously, what the town needed at exactly that moment. Remember the fundamental problem Nevada had been wrestling with for years, the desperate need to replace criminal ownership with genuinely respectable ownership instead, to pry Las Vegas loose entirely from the grip of men who could never hope to pass an honest background check. And here, dropping in from the sky almost like some eccentric gift, was Howard Hughes. Strange, certainly, and deeply reclusive without question, but undeniably legitimate. A famous public businessman whose considerable fortune had been earned openly in the wider business world, not skimmed quietly from counting rooms. Hughes represented an entirely new kind of Las Vegas owner, and his ongoing buying spree pointed the way directly toward the town's eventual salvation, where the resorts had previously been held by shadowy, nameless figures. They were now steadily passing into the hands of one of the most famous legitimate business tycoons anywhere in America. It was a strange and stumbling first step forward, driven far more by one man's personal peculiarities than by any grand deliberate plan on anyone's part. But it clearly demonstrated something genuinely powerful. Respectable money could, in fact, successfully own and operate Las Vegas. The mob's grip on the town wasn't entirely unbreakable after all, it turned out. And in Hughes's eccentric shopping spree, Nevada's officials finally glimpsed the workable model that would eventually, deliberately transform the entire town and wash away much of its criminal past for good. Hughes was undeniably strange, but he was also, crucially, entirely legitimate, a genuine public businessman rather than some shadowy figure operating under a nickname. His extended buying spree gave Nevada's officials a genuinely golden idea to work with. If wealthy, respectable corporations could somehow be persuaded to own casinos going forward, the state could finally wash out the deep stain of organized crime and replace those suitcases of hidden cash with actual shareholders and properly audited books instead. So the relevant law was carefully changed to make corporate ownership considerably easier, opening the floodgates for publicly traded companies to move in and take over. It was, in effect, a quiet revolution disguised carefully as routine paperwork. Slowly, over time, the men in sharp suits were gradually replaced by men in boardrooms instead, and Las Vegas began its long, gradual transformation from a mob playground into a legitimate, if still gloriously excessive, American industry. The lesson Nevada's officials ultimately drew from the entire Hughes affair was genuinely profound, even though the affair itself had been driven almost entirely by one man's personal oddities, rather than any careful, deliberate strategy on anyone's part. What Hughes had proven, almost entirely by accident, was that a legitimate public figure could successfully own major casinos, that these resorts didn't necessarily have to remain forever in criminal hands going forward. He was strange, certainly, but he was also genuinely clean, a public businessman whose fortune had absolutely nothing to do with skimmed cash or suitcases full of untraceable money. If one legitimate tycoon could successfully own the Strip, state officials reasoned, why couldn't many others do the same thing? Why not an entirely new class of respectable owners taking over across the board? The idea that eventually crystallized was genuinely elegant in its underlying simplicity. If wealthy, reputable corporations could be actively encouraged to own casinos, Nevada could finally solve the exact problem that had haunted the state for years. The stain of organized crime could be thoroughly scrubbed away, not through dramatic raids and criminal prosecutions, but through a simple change in ownership itself. Replace the shadowy individual men with proper corporate boards. Replace the hidden cash with shareholders and regular dividends. Replace the skim entirely with audited books that any regulator could freely examine at will. It was a clever way to keep the golden goose alive and well, while quietly changing exactly whose hands held onto it. But there was a practical obstacle standing in the way, one rooted deeply in how corporations typically function. A publicly traded company answers to countless individual shareholders, and the existing laws at the time made it genuinely cumbersome for such a company to hold a gambling license in the first place, tangled up in requirements that were really better suited to individual private owners. So Nevada did the sensible thing for a state determined to protect its single most valuable industry. It simply changed the relevant law. The rules were carefully rewritten to make corporate ownership of casinos considerably more straightforward and attractive, clearing the legal path for publicly traded companies to move in and start buying up the Strip in earnest. It was, in a very real sense, a genuine revolution, though one disguised entirely as dry legislative paperwork and minor statutory tinkering. There was no dramatic public showdown, no army of federal agents storming the counting rooms in a raid. Just a quiet change to the existing statutes that ultimately transformed absolutely everything about how the town operated. With the legal barriers finally removed, the floodgates opened wide. Large, respectable, publicly traded corporations began actively acquiring the resorts one by one, bringing with them their corporate boards, their professional accountants, their shareholders, and their fundamentally different way of conducting business overall. This transformation didn't happen overnight by any means, but it happened steadily and surely, resort by resort, year after year. And so the great replacement gradually unfolded across the Strip. The men in sharp suits, the figures carrying quiet nicknames and suitcases full of cash, gradually gave way to men in boardrooms instead, to executives and directors who answered directly to stockholders and government regulators alike. The skim itself, that elegant, invisible form of theft, had no real place remaining in a publicly traded company whose every single dollar was carefully tracked and audited and openly reported. The old way of doing business simply couldn't survive under this new model of corporate ownership. And as the corporation steadily moved in, the mob's long era in Las Vegas began its slow, ultimately irreversible fade into history. The town that emerged from this whole transformation was fundamentally different in its bones, though a casual visitor might not have noticed the change at first glance. The lights still blazed brightly every night. The tables still ran exactly as before. The excess still overflowed in every direction. But underneath the surface, Las Vegas had become something genuinely new, a legitimate American industry now, run by proper corporations, governed by shareholders, and answerable to the ordinary rules of standard business practice. It was still gloriously, unapologetically excessive in every way, still devoted entirely to fantasy and indulgence, but the deep shadows had finally lifted. The mob playground was steadily becoming a corporate empire instead. And a corporate empire, as it turned out, had the resources and the appetite needed to make the Strip more spectacular than the old bosses had ever even dared to dream possible, especially once it discovered that a single legendary performer could reliably fill a showroom night after night, month after month, with no end in sight. By the late 1960s, one of the most famous men anywhere in the world found himself in a strange and genuinely uncomfortable position for someone who had once conquered the entire world of entertainment. His movie career had stalled badly, and his cultural moment seemed to have passed him by entirely. Then Elvis Presley walked onto a Las Vegas stage in 1969 and reminded absolutely everyone exactly who he was. The resulting residency was electric, a sweating, jump-suited, full-throated resurrection that packed the showroom night after night and welded the image of Elvis permanently to the image of Las Vegas itself. It also proved a powerful new truth about the entire town. A single legendary performer, planted in one hotel for an extended run, could reliably draw enormous crowds all on his own. The residency model was born in that moment, and the Strip had discovered that entertainment wasn't merely decoration on the side. It was a genuine magnet worth an absolute fortune. By the late 1960s, Elvis Presley found himself in a strange and genuinely uncomfortable place for a man who had once conquered the entire world of popular music. He had been the most electrifying figure in music history, a genuine cultural earthquake felt across the entire country. But the years had steadily dulled his shine somewhat. His movie career had stalled badly into a long string of largely forgettable pictures, and his moment at the very center of popular culture seemed to have passed him by completely. He was still famous, of course, still deeply beloved by millions, but there was a distinct whiff of the has-been clinging to him now. A growing sense that his greatest days were firmly behind him. The king, some people whispered quietly, had lost his crown for good. Then he walked onto a Las Vegas stage in 1969 and thoroughly detonated every single one of those lingering doubts. What happened inside that showroom was nothing short of a genuine resurrection, a full-throated, sweat-soaked, jumpsuited reminder of exactly who Elvis Presley truly was and exactly what he was still capable of doing on stage. The fatting act vanished entirely, and in its place stood a performer at the absolute height of his considerable powers, commanding the entire stage, pouring everything he had left into the assembled crowd. Night after night, he did precisely this, and night after night the showroom overflowed with fans, packed tightly with people desperate to witness the king reborn right before their eyes. The residency was electric in the most literal sense imaginable, a genuine current running steadily between the performer and his audience that neither side could realistically resist. Elvis gave those crowds a spectacle they would remember for the rest of their entire lives, and in return, they gave him back the adoration and cultural relevance he had genuinely feared were gone forever. It was a perfect marriage of star and setting, each one lifting the other higher. Elvis found his own triumphant second act, and Las Vegas found itself permanently bound to one of the most iconic performers who had ever lived. The image of Elvis and the image of the Strip fused together permanently in the public imagination, and they've never really come apart since that moment. But beyond the personal drama of a legend reclaiming his rightful throne, this particular residency taught Las Vegas a lesson of enormous practical value going forward. Here was undeniable, profitable proof that a single legendary performer, planted in one hotel for an extended run, could draw enormous crowds entirely on his own merits. Elvis didn't need a rotating lineup of different acts or a constant parade of fresh performers. He himself was the entire attraction, powerful enough to fill a showroom night after night for the full length of a long engagement. His name alone was enough to pull people across the entire country and directly into the seats. This was a revelation carrying genuinely staggering implications for exactly how the town conducted business going forward. If one truly great star could anchor an entire hotel and reliably summon massive crowds for weeks or even months on end, then entertainment clearly wasn't merely a pleasant garnish sitting on top of the gambling. It was a genuine magnet in its own right, a force fully capable of drawing enormous numbers of paying visitors directly through the doors. And every single one of those visitors, once inside the building, represented a potential gambler, a diner, a shopper, a spender of one kind or another. The star filled the entire building, and the building itself did the rest of the work, converting the crowds Elvis gathered into steady revenue across the whole resort. Thus was born the residency model, an approach that would go on to shape Las Vegas entertainment for decades to come. Book a genuinely legendary performer for a long, exclusive run. Let their existing fame do the heavy work of filling the seats, and reap the rewards throughout the entire resort as a result. It fundamentally transformed how the town thought about its entertainment offerings, elevating them from a supporting role into a genuine engine of profit in their own right. Elvis had proven conclusively that a single name on the marquee could be worth an absolute fortune, and Las Vegas took that particular lesson to heart permanently. The king had returned to life on that stage, and in doing so, he had shown the entire Strip a brand new way to mint real money from pure stardom. But even as the town perfected its considerable appeal to adult visitors, a restless dreamer somewhere was already wondering whether Las Vegas might welcome an entirely different kind of guest altogether. Not everyone believed that Las Vegas should remain purely a den for grown adults, and one particular restless dreamer decided to test out a wild new theory of his own. He built an entire resort themed completely around a circus, complete with actual trapeze artists flipping through the air directly above the gambling floor, and a full carnival midway packed with games for visitors to enjoy. The early results were genuinely chaotic and strange. A casino where small children wandered freely and acrobats soared directly over the slot machines below. Critics scoffed openly at the whole concept. And yet this particular idea planted a seed that would eventually bloom decades later, the notion that a casino could function as a genuine spectacle, a themed wonderland, a destination suitable for the entire family and not merely for the lonely, solitary gambler. Las Vegas was beginning to wonder, almost for the first time, whether it could become something considerably more than just a den of vice. It could become a theme park complete with its own cashier's cage. For its entire existence up to this particular point, Las Vegas had understood itself primarily as an adult playground, a place built firmly around the grown-up vices of gambling, drinking, and glamorous nightlife. This was the town's core identity, its whole fundamental reason for existing, the fantasy it had always sold to weekend visitors looking to escape their ordinary lives back home. The idea of bringing children into Las Vegas would have struck most people at the time as faintly ridiculous, a bit like bringing a toddler along to a serious poker game. But not everyone accepted that the town absolutely had to remain so narrowly focused forever, and one particular restless dreamer decided to challenge that entire assumption head-on. His wild theory took physical form in a resort themed, of all possible things, around a full circus, and he certainly didn't do it halfway. This was a genuine casino featuring actual trapeze artists flipping and soaring through the air directly above the gambling floor below, real acrobats performing overhead, while gamblers sat concentrating on their cards underneath them. There was also a full carnival midway packed with games, the kind of colorful, noisy attractions you'd typically expect to find at a county fair, somewhat incongruously dropped right into the heart of a serious gambling establishment. The end result was a place genuinely unlike anything the Strip had ever seen before, a real circus wrapped entirely around a casino, or perhaps more accurately, a casino cleverly smuggled inside a full circus. The early results were, by most honest accounts, fairly chaotic and strange. Imagine the scene for a moment. A gambling floor where small children wandered wide-eyed among the rows of slot machines, where trained acrobats twirled through the air above adults desperately trying to concentrate on their card games below, where the solemn business of steadily losing money collided head-on with the giddy, chaotic atmosphere of a traveling carnival. It was a genuinely jarring mixture, an experiment that didn't quite seem to know what it wanted to be, and honestly, it showed in the results. The two very different worlds it tried to blend together, adult gambling and childlike wonder, sat together rather awkwardly, with neither one feeling fully comfortable alongside the other. The critics, predictably enough, scoffed openly at the whole venture. According to the established wisdom governing Las Vegas at the time, this was simple folly, a confused muddle that fundamentally misunderstood the entire nature of the town itself. Gambling was strictly for adults. Everyone already knew that much, and cluttering up the casino floor with wandering children and flying trapeze artists seemed at best like a pointless distraction, and at worst, like an outright disaster waiting to happen. The serious men who actually ran the Strip shook their heads at the whole spectacle, thoroughly confident that the town's real business had absolutely no room for such nonsense. A circus, of all things. It was easy enough to dismiss outright, but dismissing it turned out to be a genuine mistake, because buried somewhere inside that chaotic early experiment was the seed of an idea that would eventually go on to reshape the entire city. The notion itself, genuinely radical for its time, was that a casino could actually be more than just a room full of gaming tables. It could be a spectacle unto itself, a themed wonderland, an immersive fantasy world that drew people in purely for the experience itself, and not merely for the gambling on offer. And if it could function as a wonderland, then perhaps it could welcome the entire family along too, not just the solitary gambler chasing his luck alone in some smoky back room. The circus resort was certainly clumsy in its actual execution, but its underlying vision genuinely proved to be prophetic in the years that followed. Las Vegas, without quite realizing it yet, was beginning to wonder whether it could become something considerably larger than a simple den of vice. Could it become a genuine destination, a place built around themed spectacle and immersive fantasy, essentially a theme park that happened to have a cashier's cage sitting right at its heart? The early circus experiments suggested that the answer might well be yes, even though the town wasn't quite ready to fully embrace that idea just yet. The seed had been planted, dormant for now, but genuinely alive, simply waiting for the right moment and the right visionary to come along and make it bloom into something truly spectacular. That particular moment was coming, and it would eventually arrive alongside a young, ambitious developer possessing a genuine genius for spectacle, and the sheer nerve required to bet absolutely everything on making Las Vegas beautiful in an entirely new way. For all its considerable growth over the decades, by the 1980s Las Vegas had grown noticeably a little tired around the edges, its resorts steadily aging, its once electric glamour gradually dulling with each passing year. Then a young, fiercely ambitious developer named Steve Wynn opened a brand new resort in 1989 that completely detonated the old established rules overnight. It featured an artificial erupting volcano positioned right out front, a genuine habitat housing live dolphins and white tigers, a lush tropical atrium bursting with greenery, and a level of polished luxury the Strip had genuinely never dared to attempt before. It was staggeringly expensive to build, and it turned out to be a colossal, undeniable success, proving conclusively that visitors would flock eagerly to pure spectacle for its own sake and spend freely once they actually arrived on the premises. Wynn had effectively invented the modern mega-resort in one stroke, and every casino owner across town suddenly realized, with a cold sense of dread, that their own aging, tired buildings were about to look like relics from a bygone era. By the 1980s, Las Vegas was genuinely suffering from a kind of quiet malaise, the sort that gradually creeps up on any place that's been coasting comfortably on its past glory for too long. The resorts that had once seemed dazzling and cutting-edge were now visibly showing their age, their glamour noticeably faded, their overall designs beginning to feel outdated and stale. The town still functioned reasonably well, still drew its usual crowds, but the electric magic that had defined its golden years had clearly dimmed considerably. There was a genuine tiredness settling over the Strip, a growing sense that its very best days might already be settling comfortably into fond memory rather than continuing into the future. What Las Vegas genuinely needed at this critical juncture was someone bold enough to completely reimagine what a resort could actually be. And that particular someone arrived in the form of Steve Wynn. Wynn was young, fiercely ambitious, and possessed of a personal vision that thoroughly dwarfed anything the tired old Strip had recently attempted. When he finally opened his new resort in 1989, he didn't merely add another hotel to the existing row of properties. He detonated the old established rules entirely, delivering a spectacle so extravagant that it forced the entire town to fundamentally rethink what was actually possible going forward. Out front stood an artificial volcano that erupted right on schedule, spewing dramatic fire and smoke into the desert night for the assembled crowds gathered specifically to watch it. It was pure theater, a completely free show carefully designed to stop passers-by dead in their tracks and pull them directly inside the resort. And the volcano itself was really only the beginning of what Wynn had built. Inside and around the resort, he assembled a genuine menagerie of wonders that felt considerably more like an elaborate fantasy than an ordinary casino. A habitat housing live dolphins, genuinely exotic and mesmerizing to watch. white tigers prowling in their own dedicated space, a lush tropical atrium bringing genuine green abundance into the very heart of the arid surrounding desert. And wrapping the entire experience together, a level of polished luxury the Strip had simply never dared to attempt before, an attention to beauty and overall quality that made every one of the older resorts look genuinely shabby by direct comparison. Wynn wasn't building a simple gambling hall with a few extra attractions bolted onto the side. He was building an entire immersive world from the ground up. It was staggeringly expensive to construct, a sum that must have seemed genuinely reckless to the more cautious voices within the industry at the time. Pouring that much money into volcano, dolphins, and tropical atriums struck plenty of skeptics as extravagance bordering dangerously on outright madness. Surely no amount of pure spectacle could possibly justify such an enormous cost. Surely the truly sensible business decision remained focused on the gaming tables, not on exotic tigers. The doubters had made this exact same mistake before in the town's history, and they went ahead and made it again here, badly underestimating the sheer power of pure spectacle to draw in and hold onto a crowd. Because the resort turned out to be a colossal, resounding success in every meaningful sense, and it proved a fundamental truth that would go on to remake the entire town going forward. Visitors flocked to it in enormous numbers, drawn purely by the spectacle for its own sake, thoroughly hypnotized by the erupting volcano and the dolphins and the tigers and the sheer immersive beauty of the entire place. And once they'd actually arrived, dazzled and delighted by everything around them, they spent money freely, exactly as Wynn had confidently bet they would from the very start. The spectacle itself was never a distraction from profit. It was the very engine driving that profit forward, a magnet that pulled people in and put them squarely in the perfect mood to open their wallets wide. Wynn had proven definitively that beauty and genuine wonder paid off, and paid off enormously well. In doing so, he had effectively invented the modern mega-resort, a template that would go on to define Las Vegas for the coming decades ahead. This was really the vision that the earlier, clumsy circus experiment had only vaguely hinted at, now finally realized with genuine polish, real genius, and overwhelming commercial success. A casino resort could function as an immersive fantasy world, a genuine destination unto itself, drawing crowds in through pure spectacle and converting all that wondered directly into steady revenue. And every single casino owner across town understood, in one sudden, cold flash of realization, exactly what Wynn's triumph actually meant for their own properties. Their own resorts, aging and increasingly ordinary by comparison, were about to look like relics sitting beside this gleaming new wonder. The bar had been raised impossibly high overnight, and everyone else in the industry would either have to rise to meet it or risk being left permanently behind in the dust. The race to build ever grander fantasies had officially begun, and it would ultimately require clearing away the past in the most dramatic fashion imaginable to make room for what came next. What followed next was one of the most remarkable reinventions any American city has ever staged in its history. To make room for an entirely new generation of enormous themed mega-resorts, Las Vegas actually began blowing up its own past piece by piece. The famous old casinos dating back to the mob era, buildings genuinely soaked in history and decades of cigarette smoke, were carefully packed with explosives and dropped to the ground in dramatic, crowd-drawing public spectacles. In their place rose entirely new colossal fantasies instead, a full-scale pyramid, a medieval castle complete with towers, a recreated slice of ancient Rome, and even an entire miniature version of a famous world city rebuilt in miniature. The Strip had transformed itself into a surreal architectural buffet where you could stroll casually past a fake canal and beneath a painted artificial sky, all within the span of a single city block. Las Vegas had apparently decided that the only tradition genuinely worth preserving was the tradition of tearing down yesterday's dream in order to build an even bigger one tomorrow. Once Steve Wynn had conclusively proven exactly what a mega-resort could realistically achieve, the rest of the Strip suddenly faced a stark and unavoidable choice. The old buildings, the aging casinos left over from previous eras, simply couldn't hope to compete with the dazzling new fantasies that Wynn's success now demanded from everyone else. And so Las Vegas made a decision that perfectly captured its restless, almost ruthless character as a city. Rather than carefully preserve its own past, it chose instead to destroy that past outright, clearing the ground completely for something considerably grander to take its place. What followed was one of the most remarkable acts of deliberate self-reinvention that any American city has ever attempted in its entire history. A genuinely wholesale demolition of the past carried out entirely in the name of the future. The method chosen was every bit as spectacular as everything else about this particular town. The famous old casinos, those storied buildings dating back to the mob era, saturated with decades of accumulated history and legend and cigarette smoke, were carefully packed full of explosives and brought crashing dramatically to the ground. And true to its established character, Las Vegas turned even this act of destruction into pure entertainment for the watching public. The controlled implosions became genuine public events. Dramatic spectacles that drew large crowds specifically to watch beloved old landmarks collapse in massive clouds of dust and fire. Only this particular town could somehow make the demolition of its own heritage into a can't-miss public attraction, essentially selling tickets, in a sense, to the deliberate erasure of its own past. There's something almost genuinely breathtaking in this particular willingness to do exactly that. Most cities around the world cling tightly to their history, carefully preserving old buildings as monuments and treating the past as something sacred and worth protecting for future generations. Las Vegas felt no such sentiment whatsoever. The old casinos, however famous they might have been, however thoroughly soaked in colorful stories, were simply obstacles standing in the way on genuinely valuable real estate, and the town blew them up without any apparent regret at all. It was a clear statement of pure priorities. The past simply wasn't precious here. The future was considerably more profitable, and in Las Vegas, profit and spectacle always won out in the end. In the newly cleared spaces rose fantasies of genuinely staggering ambition, colossal themed mega-resorts specifically designed to transport visitors to entirely different worlds altogether. A great pyramid evoking ancient Egypt in stunning detail. A medieval castle complete with towering turrets and battlements. A slice of ancient Rome brought vividly to life right in the middle of the desert. An entire miniature version of a famous world city, its landmarks faithfully recreated for tourists who would likely never actually leave the Strip itself. Each individual resort functioned as its own complete, self-contained universe, a full immersive fantasy environment carefully designed to swallow visitors whole and never quite let them go afterward. The cumulative effect of all this was genuinely surreal, well beyond anything the earlier version of the Strip could ever have imagined possible. Las Vegas had become a bizarre architectural buffet, a place where you could stroll casually past a recreated canal and beneath a painted fake sky, all within the span of a single city block, wandering effortlessly from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe to imperial Rome over the course of a single afternoon. The ordinary rules governing geography, history, and reality itself seemed to simply dissolve into a delirious jumble of themed fantasy. Nowhere else on the entire planet offered anything remotely like it. This compressed dream world of impossible juxtapositions, all of it carefully engineered to dazzle and disorient and delight visitors in equal measure. And underneath all this spectacle, the deeper truth about the town revealed itself once again, clear as ever. Las Vegas had decided that the only tradition it truly honored was the ongoing tradition of tearing down yesterday's dream in order to build an even bigger one tomorrow. It would forever remain a place caught in the constant act of reinventing itself, demolishing yesterday to make room for tomorrow, never particularly sentimental, never fully satisfied, always chasing after the next, grander fantasy waiting just around the corner. The Mojave buildings that had originally defined this town were now gone completely, reduced to rubble and fading memory, replaced entirely by corporate wonders built on a scale nobody could have previously imagined. The transformation that had begun quietly with legitimate corporate ownership had finally reached its spectacular conclusion. Las Vegas had remade itself completely from the ground up, and it was about to discover exactly how far this powerful new model could actually reach beyond its own borders. By the turn of the new century, this entire transformation was genuinely complete. The desperate little railroad town, the mob's playground, the atomic curiosity of the 50s, had become one of the single most powerful entertainment industries anywhere on the planet, run entirely by vast publicly traded corporations, with resorts stretching skyward in gleaming towers of glass and light. Gambling itself was now merely one revenue stream among many available, sitting comfortably alongside luxury shopping, world-class dining, sprawling nightclubs, and stadium-scale concert venues. And this particular model proved so genuinely profitable that these Las Vegas giants eventually exported it wholesale, building glittering casino empires in distant corners of the entire world. That little patch of green grass hidden in the Mojave had become a truly global brand, a way of doing business, a manufactured fantasy sold successfully on every single continent. The house, it turned out in the end, had learned how to win absolutely everywhere. By the turn of the new century, this long, strange journey had genuinely reached a kind of completion. It's worth pausing here to marvel at the full arc of it, because the transformation really was total. This was the desperate railroad town, born because a train simply needed water. It was the mob's playground, funded entirely by skimmed cash and shadow loans arranged in back rooms. It was the atomic curiosity, selling cocktails calmly beneath rising mushroom clouds. And now, after all of that history, it had become one of the most powerful entertainment industries found anywhere on the entire planet, a genuine colossus run by vast publicly traded corporations, its resorts stretching skyward in gleaming towers built from glass and light. The nature of the underlying business had shifted profoundly over the course of this long journey. In the old days, gambling had been the entire point, the tables themselves serving as the beating heart of every single enterprise in town. But the modern corporate version of Las Vegas had discovered that gambling was really just one revenue stream among many available, and not always even the largest one at that. Around the casino floors now sprawled an entire ecosystem built purely for profit, luxury shopping capable of rivaling the finest cities anywhere in the world. World-class dining from genuinely celebrated chefs, sprawling nightclubs poolsing steadily until dawn broke each morning, and stadium-scale concerts drawing absolutely enormous crowds night after night. The town had learned how to extract money from its visitors in a dozen different directions simultaneously, and the gambling itself was now just one channel among many within that steady flood. This particular diversification represented a genuine masterstroke of corporate thinking, and it made these resorts considerably more resilient and more profitable than they had ever been before. A visitor who never placed a single bet during their entire stay could still spend lavishly on shopping, dining, live shows, and nightlife, pouring money steadily into the resort through countless different avenues all at once. The mega-resort had effectively become a complete world unto itself, specifically designed to capture every possible dollar available. A self-contained universe of pure indulgence where gambling was simply one pleasure among an entire menu of expensive temptations laid out for guests to choose from. The corporations running these properties had successfully transformed the once narrow business of the casino into the vast, multifaceted industry of the modern destination resort. And this model proved so wildly successful that it simply couldn't be contained within the Mojave Desert any longer. The Las Vegas giants, having thoroughly perfected their winning formula, looked outward at the wider world and realized that their particular way of doing business could genuinely be exported almost anywhere on Earth. So they built accordingly, raising glittering casino empires on foreign shores in distant corners of the globe, carrying the Las Vegas formula successfully across oceans and entire continents. The fantasy that had originally been manufactured out in the desert turned out to be genuinely, endlessly reproducible, a template that worked just as effectively in far-flung places as it had on the original strip itself. Think for a moment about what this actually means for that improbable little meadow where the whole story first began. That modest patch of green grass hidden in the Mojave, fed by hidden underground springs, had become a genuine global brand, a recognized name known worldwide, a way of doing business copied and exported successfully around the entire world. Las Vegas was no longer merely a city in any conventional sense. It had become an idea, a manufactured fantasy of indulgence and spectacle that could be packaged neatly and sold successfully on every single continent. The meadows had, in a very real sense, conquered the globe, spreading their particular dream of neon lights and chance to places their original founders could never possibly have imagined existing. What began as a few simple dice games running in a dusty railroad saloon had grown steadily into a worldwide industry, a colossal engine of profit exported successfully across the entire planet. The essential transaction at the heart of it all remained exactly what it had always been from the very beginning. Hope traded reliably for the near certainty of loss. Pleasure sold consistently at a price that always favored the seller in the end. But the scale of it all had become almost incomprehensible to imagine. A global empire built entirely on the same simple, ancient principle that had once run those very first backroom games in Block 16. Las Vegas had traveled an astonishing distance from its humble, dusty beginnings, and yet, at its core, it was still doing precisely what it had always done from day one. And so we arrive, finally, at the improbable end of an equally improbable story. Consider for a moment just how absurd the whole thing genuinely is. A place with no meaningful water to speak of, no natural shade, no obvious reason to exist at all, somehow became the brightest, busiest, most extravagant city of its particular kind anywhere on Earth. All because a broke desert state made one desperate bet during the very worst of times and simply refused to look back afterward. Every single element of Las Vegas stands today as a monument to human stubbornness and human appetite in equal measure, a city that took a scorching, empty valley and filled it completely with light purely because it could. The original springs that once fed that quiet meadow are long gone now, buried entirely beneath fountains and towers and endless glowing signs. But the underlying gamble that built this entire place still runs day and night without pause, never closing, never sleeping, still whispering that exact same old promise to anyone willing to listen closely enough. Take a moment now, as our journey winds slowly toward its rest, to sit quietly with the sheer absurdity of everything you've just heard. By every rational measure imaginable, this city simply shouldn't exist at all. Consider carefully the place where it actually stands. A valley with no meaningful water supply, no real shade, no natural resources worth mentioning, no strategic importance of any kind, nothing that would ever mark it out as a spot destined for genuine greatness. For most of recorded history, it was simply a place to be actively avoided, a punishing stretch of desert that discouraged human settlement through sheer heat and thirst and emptiness alone. And yet, against every reasonable expectation, it became the brightest, busiest, most extravagant city of its kind found anywhere on the entire planet. How exactly did such an impossible thing come to happen? Trace the whole story back carefully, and you find at the pivotal moment. A broke desert state making one desperate bet during the very worst economic times imaginable. Nevada, cornered completely by the Great Depression, gambled on legalizing the very vices that more respectable places everywhere else had firmly rejected, and then simply refused to lose its nerve or look back afterward. From that single anxious wager placed at rock bottom, everything else eventually grew. The whole glittering colossus, the entire global empire, ultimately rests on a decision made purely out of desperation by people who simply needed to keep the lights on for one more year. There was no grand vision at play here, no sense of destiny guiding anyone's hand, just a nervous bet that happened to pay off far beyond anyone's wildest possible imagination at the time. Everything about Las Vegas, when you really stop to look closely at it, stands as a monument to two of humanity's most powerful and stubborn traits: our shared refusal to accept any real limits, and our essentially bottomless appetite for pleasure of every kind. The town exists purely because people decided that a scorching, empty valley could be filled entirely with light, and then filled it with light simply because they could. It's a genuine triumph of pure will over reason, of desire over common sense. A place built directly in defiance of every practical objection the surrounding desert could possibly raise. That defiant, appetite-driven stubbornness is written clearly into every neon sign, every soaring tower, every fountain dancing gracefully where there ought to be nothing but sand. And here's one final detail worth carrying quietly with you into sleep tonight, a gentle irony sitting right at the heart of this entire story. Remember those original springs we started with? Those modest artesian waters that started everything from the very beginning? The little green miracle that gave the meadows their original name and drew the very first travelers to stop and stay a while? Those springs are gone completely now, exhausted and buried, paved over and largely forgotten beneath all the fountains and towers and endless glowing signs. The city grew so enormous over time that it eventually consumed the very source that had first made it possible in the first place. The meadow that gave Las Vegas its original name has vanished entirely beneath the sheer weight of everything it eventually became. And yet the essential thing, the true engine driving this entire place, runs on exactly as it always has from the very start. The gamble that built this city still operates steadily day and night, never closing its doors, never pausing for breath, never truly sleeping at all. The tables still turn steadily. The wheels still spin round and round. The money still flows in its own ancient, familiar direction. And that same old promise still hangs quietly in the air, whispered gently to anyone willing to listen closely enough. Come and try your luck tonight. Maybe tonight will finally be your night. It's the very same promise that once echoed softly through the dusty back rooms of Block 16, unchanged across all these many years, still quietly drawing dreamers steadily into the light. So there it is, the whole improbable tale laid out from beginning to end. From a quiet field of grass fed by hidden springs to a city that genuinely never sleeps, a place that had no real business existing at all, became one of the most famous places found anywhere on Earth. All of it happened through simple human stubbornness, raw appetite, and one desperate bet that refused to ever be walked back once it was made. The meadows themselves are buried now, but the dream they accidentally gave birth to still blazes on through every single desert night, tireless and unsleeping, forever whispering its same old promise to the hopeful and the foolish alike, in equal measure. And on that quiet thought, we can finally let the neon blur gently and fade away, drifting at last toward a well-earned rest. So there you have it, the whole absurd, dazzling, genuinely impossible story of how one scorching patch of desert became the single brightest city anywhere on Earth. Tonight we wandered together from a quiet field of grass fed by hidden springs, through the dusty back rooms of a rough little railroad town, past the men in their sharp suits with their suitcases full of skimmed cash, all the way to the towering corporate wonderland that blazes steadily in the Mojave today. We watched a broke desert state make one desperate bet and simply refuse to look back afterward. We saw dreamers and gamblers and reclusive billionaires pass through, volcanoes and dolphins and mushroom clouds rising along the horizon, and an entire city built on the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that some places were simply never meant to exist in the first place. And there's something quietly wonderful buried in all of it when you really think it through. Because Las Vegas, for all its considerable excess and all its shameless appetite, really is a genuine monument to human persistence, to the strange and beautiful truth that people will look at an empty, unforgiving valley and simply decide to fill it with light purely because they can. It took thirst and desperation and no small amount of foolishness to build this place. But it also took real imagination, genuine nerve, and the particular kind of hope that keeps building steadily even when the desert itself keeps saying no at every turn. So tonight, as you settle comfortably into your own soft bed, surrounded by cool air and clean water and not a single scorpion in sight anywhere nearby, maybe spare a gentle thought for that little meadow buried somewhere beneath all the neon, and for all the restless souls who somehow turned a complete wasteland into a genuine wonder. History is often genuinely ridiculous, frequently reckless in its choices, and yet somehow always deeply human at its core. It reminds us that even in the harshest, emptiest places imaginable, people will always find some way to dream something entirely new into being. Rest now. Let the neon blur softly and fade away completely. The desert outside is quiet tonight. The old springs sleep peacefully beneath the sand, right where they've always been. And there is nothing left for you to do tonight but drift softly and slowly into an easy, thoroughly well-earned sleep.